We had an encounter 2 years ago on the edge of a small town here in Arizona. I was coming home from work one night and saw something shaped like a large man, only very large, standing in the shadows across my driveway. But it looked disgusting, like I could see bits of flesh and bone, even. It didn't look right. At first, I thought it was just a large somebody who had lost their way, but as I drove closer, even though there were streetlights, I could see this was no man. So I pulled up to my house, and as soon as I stopped the car, this thing got very active, jumping around, low onto its knees and then standing again, like it was trying to intimidate. You could tell by its motions that it was not just another person trying to walk through the grass. This was something that had no use for us and wanted to do the opposite of what you'd expect. I'm sure if I had stayed out another couple of seconds, this thing would have charged me. But as soon as I saw it stirring like this, I drove in. Like many people who see these things, they're not afraid nor will run, but some want to fight them off. I cannot say that I would have done anything different in this situation, except for one thing. Huge mistake. Turns out, if they do run after you, catch you, it just takes one swipe of their hand, and you're gone. For the last 2 years, me and my family have now been looking over our shoulders, scared to death of what can happen if we see one again. I haven't really had another sighting like this since that night. But some nights, I swear, I can hear howling in the distance. I believe I have heard them near the river as well in my small town. If you listen closely when there is no wind on a clear night, you can catch something not quite right in the early morning hours. It feels like it could take practice, but if you listen very closely to the sounds of nature at those times, like crickets and stuff, you will hear it back up in pitch, like it's grading on an upward scale, higher than birds or insects can ever go. And sometimes the insects will go completely silent. That's when you know something isn't quite right. The atmosphere changes. I always feel like I'm being watched when I hear this. I'm not too scared to leave the house, but I do check the back mirror constantly when driving, always looking over my shoulder, especially at night. I have a 5-year-old son who has seen him as well. He was only around 4 years old at the time. He told me that it was scary, that he didn't want to be playing outside anymore because the monster is out there. The most shocking part of all of this is that one time, when we were a couple miles into town, we branched off from one of the streets to the other to a family's house. Now over here, there's this alleyway between a few houses where nobody ever seems to go. This thing was making noise down there. Whatever it was doing, it was waking people up very early in the morning. I think nobody would come out of their houses for hours after that. They were afraid this thing was around. It does things like startles you by being very active and moves out of sight before being seen or heard from again. I guess sometimes my family's neighbors have talked about seeing a large black shape running off into the woods at night. Nobody really knows who or what it is. Hey, I was reading your stories, and I wanted to share this one. It happened when I was a kid in front of an old schoolhouse. The place had been abandoned for quite some time, and my friends and I were out playing that day. We saw something moving around inside the building, so we decided to wait until it came out again. A few minutes later, something moved in front of the window. Just when we thought it had come out, it quickly went behind the building, and we lost sight of whatever it was. It came around again, and this time I got a clear look at what appeared to be some sort of wolf or dog, but with wide shoulders, much like a football player would have. It actually appeared to look more like a large upright coyote than anything else. It was freaky looking. At one point, we actually thought it had spotted us and began coming toward us. We nearly wet ourselves before it went back behind the schoolhouse again. From what we could see briefly, the creature was dark all over with a long snout, wide shoulders. It kind of reminded me of an ape, but very different looking. Its hair was almost falling out. It was very scary. We never talked about it with our parents, but as we got older, we would sometimes bring it up. Knowing all the things I do now, I really do wonder if it was a skinwalker. I had another friend growing up who actually just very recently shared with me his experience, which he granted me full permission to share with you. The similarities between what he saw and I did are striking. Here's his story. I was about 12 years old, and I had just gotten home after walking back from a friend's house. My friend lived next to an open lot with several trees in it. It also had a small creek that ran along one side of the property border, going into a big river that cut through the center of town. To be honest, I never felt comfortable there going by myself. You could often hear strange noises coming from over there at night, and it gave me the creeps. Plus, I'm pretty sure I've seen some pretty sketchy homeless people. Can't be too safe. Anyway, I was walking to my house and passed by that open lot when I noticed a figure moving between some trees. It moved quickly from one to another, as if it were pacing back and forth. Just then, my dog gets spooked and starts howling at the top of his lungs, trying to jump out of my arms. He somehow slips from my tight grip, takes off running down the street in a panic, away from whatever the figure was. I start yelling at him to come back, but he wouldn't listen. The next thing I know is that something starts moving toward me between two trees. It's headed right for me. I froze, and before I could even think about turning around to run, I saw it. In the darkness between those two trees, I caught a glimpse of an upright animal-like figure with long black hair, golden, staring eyes. It was like looking into death, honestly. It reminded me of a dead, rotting coyote. Gross. You could visibly see flesh missing from its face and head, and the stench was horrendous. I didn't waste a second. I turned and ran as fast as I could away from the thing, without ever looking back. This thing, though, moved incredibly swiftly for whatever it was. I luckily escaped. A few days after, I'd asked my neighbor about it. She said that the same thing had happened to her a few months earlier. She described it as the same thing that I had seen. I don't know what they are, but now I'm curious to find out if there were any other incidents like what I saw that night. Maybe there are more stories out there. The incident that happened to my friend is very real and similar to the one I had as a kid. It really makes me wonder what sort of horrible creature I witnessed that day. We were in the area of Ridgway in Colorado during the winter months. It was 2 days before Christmas when I stopped at a small gas station. I had forgot to get my dad a Christmas present, so I was hoping to score him a neat little novelty gift from Colorado. When I was done, I decided that I wanted to go home the long way, instead of taking the highway back up north where I live. I went towards that direction and got on 90 to head back. There's a small town called Crawford, not too far from there, I believe. The road takes you through this little valley, which has nothing on either side of it, but ranges at high elevation and hills all around. Not to mention mountain-type hills, just like big, small rolling hills. My friend was in the passenger seat. We're talking about random stuff, when she happened to look out the back window. She said she saw something in the rearview mirror. She sees behind the car and says, "What's that?" I look over my shoulder to see this big black dog running alongside the car that has made its way from behind the vehicle. I slow down, and so does this thing. So I speed up and it speeds up. Now we're thinking, is this a lost dog or something? But then I get a better view as it stands up on two legs and violently tries ripping the door off our vehicle. I speed up again and it jumps down, but I don't think we got away that easily. The look on this thing was demonic. Red eyes and a black muzzle, kind of like a horse's face, very elongated, more so than any other regular dog. This was like an animal from hell. It didn't just have black skin. The fur was black, but the parts of skin appeared to be grayish. We were both shocked, didn't know what to do really, so we just kept driving, looking out the back window to see if it was still behind us. It wasn't until later when my friend's mom called her that my friend was so freaked out and told her mom what had chased us. My mom's friend just says, "You guys have to be drunk or on drugs." I told her that we weren't. Was this a skinwalker? I've never seen anything like that in my life and was too scared to go back up there. I'm hoping it wasn't a skinwalker or anything. I've heard that they mark people. I've always been open to things and never thought much about spirits or demons. But after all of this has happened, I'm now just too scared to go back up there. Also, my friend's aunt is Native American, Lakota and Sioux. She said that maybe it was some kind of spirit, but of course my friend's mom is the total opposite of her sister. Firm atheist, doesn't believe in any of it. Anyway, the way it looked at us, everything, it still haunts me. It's like it was angry we were in that part of the road. I don't even recall where it came from. Since then, I have been obsessively looking up information on skinwalkers, and they're supposed to be these supernatural beings who can take any form of any kind of animal. Help me as I search for answers. This was back in the 1960s, when I worked for the U.S. Forest Service, doing fire protection work in areas covering an enormous amount of land in 3 adjoining counties. At the time, these had the highest number of forest fires per year than any part of the country at the time. If this happened today, they would have been called wildfires for sure, and it would probably be a terrorist act against our forest by some crazed lunatic who hates trees. Okay, maybe that's being a little overdramatic, but I think you get the idea. One day, when I was about 20 years old, I went out on patrol duty up one side of a mountain and down the other, keeping a check on some crews that were building fire breaks. It was hot and dry like it normally is in northern Arizona, out here in July and August when wildfire season is at its peak. I had just finished my lunch, and I heard a loud howling coming up from behind me, where there was a cliff about 40 feet up, with a rock slide at its base. This was way back before they built any picnic areas, or even paved roads up there. Nobody else knew it was there. There hadn't been any elk herd around for several years due to overhunting at this point, by everybody who wanted deer, just due to the severe lack of rain we had been experiencing. Since this encounter happened almost 50 years ago now, I can't remember what time of the day it was exactly, but at first, I thought it might be some kids from Flagstaff, maybe having a good time, playing games and romancing one another in the wilderness they had found up there. But when I heard this loud howling during this dry season, without any elk around to attract them, it just didn't seem right. So I took my .38 caliber revolver out of its holster, began walking toward where these strange sounds seemed to be coming from, as fast as I could. The unusual thing about this sound is that it did not seem like any animal sound. Rather, it appeared more human. As soon as I got there, my worst fear was confirmed. A full-grown man wearing animal skins was standing on top of that rock slide. The only ones wearing animal skins at the time that I was aware of were the Navajo, who lived in the area to the north near Lava Shell Dam, 15 miles away from this location. There were no Navajos working for the U.S. Forest Service back then or living anywhere near this mountain. I slowly walked away from him when he began making grunting noises and angry growling sounds like a bear would do when it's trying to intimidate somebody defending its territory. He quickly seemed to disappear from the cliff, and I was not going to stick around after that. Later on, I got in my Jeep and drove off to Flagstaff, where I told a friend about what had happened. He knew all about these guys because they had been terrorizing the locals, killing cattle, or just mutilating them by taking out their organs and taking off their flesh. The Navajos, from what I was aware, called them Skinwalkers. Others would call them shapeshifters, but they're just human beings who can change into animals and kill to satisfy their unquenchable bloodlust. When we went back up there with the sheriff's deputy from the county, we found some of the remains of an animal that had been half-eaten. It was lying on top of a rock slide with its head and neck completely removed from the rest of its body. That's all I'll share for now, but I've had so many disturbing experiences back in the day, it's not funny, and I've learned a lot. Maybe I'll sit down and share with you more from an old ranger like me. Thanks for reading. A group of us were out by the reservoir here in Southern California. There is a story about this certain area. The rumor goes that I guess there was an Indian res and they destroyed it to build a dam or something, or took over their land, something like that. But some of them refused to ever leave. My grandfather told me he saw one years ago when he was just a little kid running around at night, being dared by his friends. But he didn't really believe it was true. After we had settled down for the night, there were coyotes howling. Then all of a sudden, more dogs joined in on the chorus. So my buddy Mike decided, hey, let's go see if we can see them. So we walk about 150 yards from our campsite, closer to the reservoir, and we're watching them. Mike sees a coyote turn around and look at us, then proceeds to stand fully erect on two legs. It looked straight at us, sprinting to the nearest tree and climbed right up, disappearing. We had heard the stories before about skinwalkers, but this time, I was convinced that they were there. We went back to camp and told our friends about what we saw next. Then, everybody's convinced there are skinwalkers around us. This one skinwalker must have been trying to blend in with the others. I'm not too sure how that works. We all slept with a gun right beside our pillows that night. The next morning, we had been awoken to the sounds of dogs howling again, except this time, they were much closer. I looked over at my friend Patrick, who was, at the time, out by the tent. He sat straight up in his sleeping bag, screaming, his eyes still tightly shut. I had to wake him up. He was having this violent nightmare. He later claimed that these skinwalker beings were trying to infiltrate his mind through nightmares. Take it what you will, but this was by far the most terrifying camping trip I've ever been on, and the closest I'd ever been to seeing and dealing with an actual skinwalker creature. Something I always thought was a myth and legend. Not anymore. My encounter with the skinwalker was almost 8 years ago now. The details can be a little fuzzy now and then, but I'll do my best to give you a rundown. A friend of mine, who's not Native American, and I, Native American, were out in Utah on an excursion. We parked our truck at the end of a pretty empty dirt road and hiked out from there. We were walking for quite some time, a good 2 miles, maybe more. Now, after about 20 minutes of going through the desert, we hear a strange noise behind us. I did not give it much thought at first, but my friend kept glancing back over his shoulder at the sound. Whatever was making these noises couldn't have been too far behind us. They were loud and very distinct sounding. They sounded somewhat like a dog barking, but different. More eerie, I guess you could say. Another few minutes go by and we see something running on all fours, stand up on two legs before disappearing again. At first, my mind did not register what it was that I saw, so I looked at my friend to say something. He just turned around and booked it. My arms seemed to move faster than they ever had before, pumping with adrenaline and fear. We made it away from the thing and back to our truck. Later that night, we couldn't stop talking about what kind of being that thing was. We were sure we had encountered a skinwalker. The next day, we drove to a nearby Navajo reservation, asked around. The people there seemed nervous and uncomfortable to talk about it, but some of them told us, yes, they're real, and we had most certainly encountered one. They said if you see this thing, you should run, because the only really way to get away from them is by outrunning them. I don't know if that's true. The gentleman that told us this was very young. So, long story short, I haven't seen or heard any more of these strange happenings since then, but this experience has changed my life forever. It's also important to mention that even though I'm native, I'm actually adopted. Both my real parents passed away at birth, so I live in Northern California. I really have no connection or education on my native heritage, so I'm not really connected to my culture. But after this sighting, it's kind of made me re-spark an interest in Native American culture altogether. I'm fairly certain that what I saw that night on the ranch was actually a skinwalker. I know enough about Navajo culture to understand that these are dark beings you should not be messing with, and doing your best to avoid. Here's what briefly happened. I grew up and still live in Arizona on a cattle ranch. Well, I stay there periodically. I don't really live there anymore. We've got the stereotypical cactus-covered hills, mountain ranges, hot summers, you get it. A few years ago, we had some issues with coyotes attacking our calves. Coyotes are not uncommon to have around ranches, but they usually don't hunt down large animals, like the way my calves were being hunted. I know, calves aren't large, but they're pretty protected, at least these were. They'd sneak up on them and just tear into them, leaving ravaged carcasses behind that my father and I would find while checking on the stock. It was pretty gruesome what they were doing to our livestock. So my dad had called me one night after talking to a friend, about his and about how best to get rid of these guys, when he came across a story about skinwalkers. I mean, you're talking about folk magic, straight out of a horror movie here. The kind where there are witches that transform into coyotes. Anyway, he told me to buy some special ribbon, red I believe, and tie it all around the cattle pens at night, so that way, what he believed were skinwalkers would not attack our livestock anymore. Of course, being young and naive, I was just brash. I just explained to him, Dad, these aren't skinwalkers. These are just regular coyotes. But he told me a story of one night he saw a couple of these things changing into men. I'm not so sure I believed him, but I did what he asked. I brought him the ribbon. I guess my father also shot at one of these things, and the entire group of these coyotes all stood up on two legs and ran off, the same way a man would, even at this speed. He firmly believes that these things were indeed a pack of hungry skinwalkers. Safe to say, I believe that ranch is cursed now, if not anything, especially after shooting at it. My uncle lived alone. He had become something of a recluse after my aunt had passed on. He was the closest thing I ever had to a father figure growing up, but the closeness never became a genuine thing. He loved me, yeah, but only from a distance. It was frustrating. My real dad was just a face in my memories that would come home long enough to argue with my mom, sleep off whatever he had been doing, then was gone and again, for days at a time. So, the bar was really set low when my uncle came along and would play ball with me, or visit me at school during recess. Very simple gestures, but at the time, They meant the world to me. The frustration came when I would want to spend my time with him where he lived. He had a trailer on several acres of land, mostly all untamed. Even the native plants were untouched, and nothing was mowed or manicured. I didn't quite understand why he was so warm, until it came to his living space. The day came when he was sick, and he would not do well if there wasn't somebody there looking after him for 2 or 3 days. I saw my chance, and I took it. He didn't want anybody to babysit him, but it was literally the doctor's orders. I was a teenager by then, but the little boy in me was reeling with delight. He seemed to have mixed feelings about it. He was happy to see me, but there was an uneasiness that I could not source. He wasn't weird or hiding any dark secrets. So, what was his big deal about having me over? I was completely lost in the experience of being out in this amazing untamed wilderness in a home with a father that I never had. It was like another world. I was soon to find out that other worlds have things that are good and bad. However, he was nice until I tried to talk about my aunt. He didn't want to talk about her in any detail whatsoever. Even if I did something as benign as ask if a certain lamp or other item had all been picked out by her, he would answer abruptly, changing the subject. Night came, and he told me that it was very important that I stay inside. I asked him why, but he struggled with giving me a coherent answer. I wasn't sure if maybe it was the heavy medication, the illness, or something else. Surely, it wasn't any terrible secret. If he was a murderer, I wouldn't be hiding inside from anyone he killed, right? When he was asleep, I stepped outside. I wasn't going to be able to see the night sky like that back in the city. Plus, I wanted some fresh air as I thought about how I could bond with my uncle. More without triggering him, of course. That's when I heard it. Above the sounds of insects, owls, and a few wolves, there came a high-pitched squeal that echoed off everything, including the sky. All other sounds vanished, as if all the animal kingdom were afraid. I won't lie. It even made every hair on my body stand on end. I'm usually that dumb kid that wants to run and find out what the strange sound was. But even as I was hesitating, as if I needed any more convincing, I saw movement in the darkness. There was a dim light like a dying candle. I immediately thought that there could have been a trespasser on the property. But if they weren't being sneaky, maybe they needed help. I called out to them. The light source then became 2 red points that now became eyes. I thought that glowing eyes were a cheesy trope left over from 60s horror movies, but this monstrous thing had them. The closest thing I can compare it to is an elk that somehow decided it was going to walk on 2 legs, but the shape was wrong. Instead of hooves, it appeared to have hands, 4 fingers specifically on each, with claws that were curved like a crescent moon. Its mouth hung open, and the only way an elk's mouth could open that wide is if the jaws were unhinged. The teeth and gums were both long, preventing the mouth from closing at all. Ribbons of saliva dripping down into the soil. With each step forward that it took, its pace quickened. Something in my brain kept me from fleeing, though. My uncle was there for one more time. The crack of his rifle made my ears ring as he fired right next to me. The shot knocked this thing backwards and let out this horrendous squeal that was almost as loud as the gunshot itself. He quickly hurried me indoors, and with a single look, I understood why he never had me over. He made some coffee and told me a strange story I'd missed while growing him. He and my aunt had accidentally invited this creature onto their land when they had mistaken it for a stranger that needed help. He told me that something about it was able to come and go as it pleased, Once it had an invitation. It got my aunt and my uncle. Said that it liked to torment him by imitating her voice some nights. It will stand outside his bedroom window and call his name with her voice. If I hadn't seen this creature, I would have claimed he was nuts. This monster was a predator. Surely, it would enjoy ripping the trailer open like a tin can, eating him alive. I mentioned this. He shook his head. He said that it would only delay killing him as long as possible. If he's gone, that it wouldn't have anybody to torment. My story reads like the plot to a bad movie. I guess that goes to show you just how objective and void of poetry tragedy really is. I worked my butt off during my teen years and my early 20s so that I would finally be able to start a family wherever I wanted. I didn't believe in luck. I believed in the grind. By the time I had the financial freedom I wanted, I was 32 and had 3 kids. I had money coming out of my ears, but never splurged. I still looked for the best bargain on a home. I even got an amazing deal on an estate, included a mansion surrounded by a whopping 12 acres of thick timber. It was called Vanishing Point. It's a classic storyline. Too good to be true. But I was used to being 100% in control of my own world, so I didn't heed to any such warnings. I never once questioned where the estate's name came from. It was the last property at the furthest point from the township, all while still being within the city proper. So hey, I figured the land was just situated at a literal vanishing point from the perspective of being in the city still. We lived there long enough to have a 4th child before anything else began happening. My 2 oldest boys would go hunting with their pellet rifles. I was trying to be a good dad that didn't hold on too tight, you know? What's all that timber if you're not allowed to explore as a kid? I wanted them to have a rich, full childhood. They left with their guns, and if they didn't come home, those guns would be the only thing that the police would ever find, other than their clothes torn to rags. There was no blood, which made my mind race even more. If they weren't dead, what was being done with them? More years passed, and I got into the habit of taking my last remaining son and our daughter out hunting. I would have let them decide whether they were going to grow up like the hunt. But after the incident, I wanted them to know how to use a gun. I wanted them to know how to shoot another living thing. As if getting out from under the shadow of being a suspect hadn't been hard enough. We had another incident. It was on a hunt with me and the 2 kids. We were somewhere where we were at equal distance from our home and the edge of the estate. In other words, far away from anywhere. It was at a place where the timber was so thick that the sun was nearly blotted out. It was magical. Otherworldly, actually. Some piping, wheezing sound filled the woods. It made things seem a lot darker than they really were. I could feel the blood in my veins go cold. The look on my daughter's face announced she was feeling similar. I looked around for my son to see what his expression was, but nowhere to be found. I called out to him. I ran those woods until my legs could not move. He had disappeared right under my nose. That's when I started becoming that parent. After more drama with the police and the rigors of heartache and grief all over again, I flat out refused to leave my daughter and my wife out of my sight. The only exception being that my wife needed to work outside the home. So I downsized and moved all of my business affairs into our home so I could watch my family full time. My wife disappeared one night on her way home when the car quit as she was on our property. Somewhere between the dead car and our house, she had totally disappeared. But not without a trace. I had trail cams set up at very strategic points. The police could corroborate my evidence that I had not hurt anybody, but they weren't ready to buy into what the cameras were showing them. In a series of blurred snapshots. The cameras pieced together the image of a bipedal abomination with the head of an elk, the teeth and the tail of a wolf, and claws like a bear. The sheer size of this thing was part of what ruled me out as a suspect. Police weren't going to go down that rabbit hole that had just opened up. I knew what it was. This was some sort of shapeshifter, a skinwalker if you will, a witch that has full control to shapeshift through dark magic, wearing the pelts of whatever animal he or she wants to change into. The magic augments the strength of this witch, so much so that it is stronger than either a normal man or animal. Not surprisingly, wearing pelts of more than one animal supposedly lets the witch change into a mixed-up abomination. I paid out no small money of mine asking how you kill such thing. And believe me, the people that know are few and far between, let alone willing to discuss the matter. They're afraid of jade knives. That was my first purchase. I spent more money than I should have having it custom crafted. Second, I would need special bullets. Third, I would need the very thing I didn't believe in. Luck. All the lips that would loosen up and tell me how to kill a skinwalker would tell me that they are so fast and supernatural. They might even be able to outrun mortal weapons, like bullets in certain forms, and at certain levels of magical skill. I didn't care what kind of fairy or wand-waving magician this was, especially after it took my daughter away from me. It had cut my family down to a member of one, and it was dragging out my misery and grief. So, I spent that time wisely, finding the places that had been stashing pelts and magical charms. Or so I thought. There was no point in using the police. They already thought I was nuts, and confiscated everything. It's literally down to me, and I'm gonna go after it, as long as it lets me live. I don't care if you believe my story, I really don't. But I feel like there has to be somebody out there who would hear this, and accept that what I'm going through is truth. Maybe somebody could reach out to me and help me kill this thing once and for all. But I don't know anybody brave enough for that. I'm going to need help. This was back in October of 2017. I saw some strange creatures. I was at my uncle's house in the backyard with my parents and a few cousins. My cousin had this spinning wheel thingy that you could either ride or push around. I got on it, and while going around, I heard some dogs barking in the distance. Not unusual, as there were Doberman pinschers in the dog pen nearby. But after a while of riding around, I started hearing something else too, like an animal rustling through leaves or grass. The thing was getting closer to me, but all else remained quiet besides the animals outside. Suddenly, they stopped making noise, which made me freeze in my spot on the wheel for a second, before checking to see if anybody else noticed anything unusual. That was when I noticed I had ridden out of the yard and was a lot closer to the woods at the edge of the property than I had thought. I could still very visibly see the rest of the family, who all appeared to have not even seen that I wasn't right there. My dad and uncle were taking care of the grill. My aunt and mother busy setting up the table, and my cousins were just messing about with a Nerf gun. Even though I could have just yelled and they would have been able to hear me, their voices seemed really far away. I mean, even the dogs from down the street seemed far more quiet. I felt this weird urge to scream and run, but also like I was rooted to the spot, frozen and could not move, just stare into the tall grass that just moments before had been rustling, and now silent and still. I knew instinctively there was something there. The best way I can describe it, it would be like when you're underwater. That kind of muffled sound where you know stuff is going on around you, but you can't quite make it out. It sounded almost like there were low voices coming from the tall grass. We'd been warned not to play in that grass in this particular spot that leads into the woods behind my uncle's house, mainly because of snakes. But this did not sound like slithering or hissing. Then, the voice-like noise stopped, and there was more rustling again, like something sure as hell was moving in there. Thankfully, sounding like it was heading back into the trees, and not towards I. But I still just waited, feeling unable to move. To this day, I am unable to tell you exactly what emerged from that grass and crawled into the woods. There were 2 of them, both very similar in size. The best example of what they should have been, I guess, would be a deer. They looked like some sort of deer, but wrong. Deer gone wrong, horribly disfigured or mutated. That's literally the best way to describe what they were. And no, they moved like they weren't used to being on 4 legs. They acted uncomfortable, awkward, stilted and stunted. I thought maybe those were the injured or deformed. But in all honesty, they just looked wrong. As soon as they disappeared back into the woods, I felt like a release, and all of a sudden, all the sounds from around me came back clear, and I heard and saw my mother call and waving at me, and telling me the hot dogs were now ready, and to come wash up. I never told them at all what I saw, because frankly, I don't know. And also, they probably wouldn't believe me if I did. Just in case they had, I want to keep thinking I imagine it. It's really the only way I can sleep at night. But I have a feeling deep down what I saw is more real than everything around me. This was long before I knew what a skinwalker was. But one time when I was 17, I was walking home from high school when I just got this discernible feeling I was being watched by something, not someone. I looked around, following my instincts. I saw nothing but a bush moving out in the distance, as if something was hiding behind it. It had to be a skinwalker. And that same year, my grandmother had had a ton of encounters with these beings, and they were constantly following her around, which meant that I too was now a target for these same beings. I had gotten so used to seeing them, I wasn't just afraid, I was always afraid. Of course, the thing with skinwalkers is that unless you know about them, know what to look for, you never even knew they existed, which is the entire point. They can possess, if that is the right word, anyone or anything. I live in constant fear. I wish there was some sort of test, like you see in the movies with demons. You know, throwing holy water at them, and if they sizzle, you kinda know. But there is nothing like that for a skinwalker. And even if there was, I can't just walk about pouring holy water over people, just in case. I think you kinda understand. But I guess once you know what you're looking for, you can tell. It's often the giveaway is the eyes. The way they move, and it seems wrong. Especially if they are walking in animal form. Ever seen a dog that looked overly intelligent? A deer or coyote that didn't walk quite right, as if it wasn't used to being on 4 legs? How about a person in the street? Someone you've never seen before, and yet something seemed both off and yet familiar. Despite never having laid eyes on them before, they seem to turn up several times throughout your day, and yet you may have traveled miles. I've had all of those things. One of the worst and most terrifying experiences was when I was followed for almost an entire day by what I am sure was one person using many different people to walk in. How could I tell? How did I know that somebody else was using all these different people to follow me around? Their eyes and smile, every single one of those very different people. From young, old, male, female, they all have that same dead look in their eyes. That same awful smile. So yeah, I'm always afraid. I'm always glancing over my shoulder, looking in the dark corners and shadows. You would be constantly on edge too if you have ever seen a regular-looking dog smirk at you, smile in only a way that a human could possibly do, as if a human was trying to control every feature. And you want to know the worst thing? What is even worse than literally knowing if people around you are actually them or something else? That is the worst. Why are they following me? If the original target, for want of a better word, was my grandmother, who is the only person who truly believes, why did they jump from her to me? Or is more my family under attack? What do they want? I just can't find the right answers, and I don't know who to talk to. Or at least who would be willing to talk to me about this. I just want to know why they won't leave me alone. I don't want to spend my entire life being afraid, always looking behind me, never trusting anybody. It's ruined friendships, relationships. Is that what they want? I'm hoping maybe, just maybe, you or somebody can send me in the right direction, or at least tell me that I'm not alone and I can leave them somehow. I just want a normal life again. Is that too much to ask? Can you help me? When my grandfather died when I was just at the tender age of 11, he left behind an old journal that had some crazy stories written inside of it about his time on the Navajo reservation back when he was much younger. He had many written stories about these creatures called Skinwalkers. Of course, I didn't believe any of them. But after what happened the other day, I'm beginning to think that these creatures are real. Not all the stories in the journal were necessarily new to me. I had heard some of the encounters before, but usually, if grandfather began to tell one, my mom would cut him off and give him the look. Sure, she wanted us to know about it and embrace our heritage, but also, she didn't want us constantly looking over our shoulders, wondering if that dog, horse, or whatever it was really just an animal. One of the stories he had managed to sneak was that one of an old lady who seemed to be able to travel remarkably quick, especially for somebody with such advanced years, who was often spotted deep in the woods whilst others were hunting, only then to be found on the reserve an impossibly short time later. To our young minds, that didn't seem particularly scary, more wondrous. She was just a little old lady, maybe with magical powers of speed. Super granny, right? But the things grandfather wrote down were far more detailed and far more frightening, depicting these people as black witches with evil intent. Not just old ladies who magically appeared in places too quickly, just to mess with others. These stories involved murder and malice, and if true, would be the stuff of nightmares. Even at 11, when I was just beginning to read more horror and stay up later to catch nighttime movies, I still didn't believe. Sure, to a young kid, say 5 or 6, an old lady could be magical. But to an 11-year-old, witches and these powers grandfather wrote about couldn't be real. I thought that for the next 10 years. Until the other day. Funnily enough, it happened back at the family home. I'd moved away a couple of years before, but still visited fairly regularly, and was home for a birthday, actually. Since all of us had moved out, my parents had gotten a dog and wanting some fresh air, and despite it being fairly late in the evening, I'd volunteered to take her for a walk. We headed out into the woods behind the house, where we'd play for hours as kids, and I'd let her run around for a while, all whilst I just enjoyed the clean air. After only a few minutes, I heard her whimpering. My first thought was that she'd maybe stood on a thorn or something, It was dark, but there was still just enough light to see that she was on the floor, shaking and whining, which was odd, since she'll usually pick a fight with anybody and is fiercely protective. I'd never seen her in this submissive stance before. Then, I saw why. A pair of eyes were glowing through the tree line. It was unnerving to say the least, as the eyes appeared to look human, but were low down like animal level, and I could just about make out the shape of a large dog, more like a wolf. This creature didn't make a noise, didn't bark, growl, nothing. It was stood and watched, and then it seemed to stand up. I don't mean like a dog when it begs. I mean it stood up like a man. My dog yelped, ran over to me, behind my legs, still shaking. I've seen her square up to the other dogs way bigger than her, but she was terrified. I bent down to comfort her, and when I looked again, it was gone. She barked once, running all the way back to the house, not bothering to wait for me, and I could tell you, I was right behind her. This was back in October of 2017. I saw some strange creatures. I was at my uncle's house in the backyard with my parents and a few cousins. My cousin had this spinning wheel thingy that you could either ride or push around. I got on it, and while going around, I heard some dogs barking in the distance. Not unusual, as there were Doberman pinschers in the dog pen nearby. But after a while of riding around, I started hearing something else too, like an animal rustling through leaves or grass. The thing was getting closer to me, but all else remained quiet besides the animals outside. Suddenly, they stopped making noise, which made me freeze in my spot on the wheel for a second, before checking to see if anybody else noticed anything unusual. That was when I noticed I had ridden out of the yard and was a lot closer to the woods at the edge of the property than I had thought. I could still very visibly see the rest of the family, who all appeared to have not even seen that I wasn't right there. My dad and uncle were taking care of the grill. My aunt and mother busy setting up the table. I used to be a park ranger for Yellowstone National Park. I was walking along the small boardwalk when I came to an overlook where I could see a herd of buffalo grazing in the distance, and some of them had wandered off into the trees where it was more difficult to see. As I was watching, one jumped out from behind a tree and ran away, back into the forest. I noticed right then that they were being hunted by something. Out of the woodline, I saw this large canine-type animal, except it wasn't a canine. At least, not your typical canine. It was walking on its hind legs, just like a person, but it was holding onto the tree, using its momentum to propel itself towards the bison that had just went into the tree. As I watched, in my mind, I was like, that's not real. That did not just happen. In less than 10 seconds, it had killed the bison, dragging its carcass off behind a large boulder further into the woodline. As soon as the body was out of sight, a group of these wolves moved out from where they were hiding inside the trees, began moving towards the carcass. There must have been at least 10 of them, but they were more than popping out from behind the trees and bushes where they had been hiding. These were wolves like I had never seen before. I've never heard in my life of wolves that were able to stand on their hind legs. Not like these. This was something else entirely. I don't know how many of these types of creatures were in the park, nor do I know where they originated from. No animal have I ever seen looks like these creatures do. They quickly began grouping back into formation, moving towards the other bison. I got scared and began making my way back to headquarters very quickly. The last thing I saw was them surrounding the remaining bison, killing them. I will never forget what I saw that day in Yellowstone, nor do I want to ever see it again. This was back in 1989. Now that the information is much more available to all of us online, I've learned that these creatures that I've seen are actually referred to as Dogman. They've been documented in all different parts of the world for centuries. These things are apparently nocturnal, using whatever shadows are available to be able to sneak up on their prey just before attacking. There's a lot more information out there too, but I'm afraid that it just might get me killed if people knew that I knew about these things. What's shocking is these things were hunting in the evening, not dark at all. And the angle I was watching them at, they were completely visible from where I was. Before you go off and start asking questions, please know that I have not seen the Dogman since 1989. As far as I know, they are not in Yellowstone anymore. At least I hope not. I'm not afraid to admit that these things exist. I have seen them with my own two eyes. Unless someone can explain what it is that I saw all those years ago, I'm not the only one. I chose to share this because it is real. People need to be aware what's out there. If you choose not to believe me, then fine. But please do your research before making a decision on it. It's very important that we understand these things a lot better than I do. I used to be a search and rescue officer, also working as a ranger. I've seen some very disturbing things out here in these parks, but never anything like this. It's been exactly 10 years since the following events occurred. This summer that I ran into what I've dubbed a Dogman. I was working in a very well-known park. I won't say which. At the time, I'd been in the service for 3 years, and this was my first real summer out on my own by myself. It was pretty intimidating, but I loved it. The first night that I had any contact with what would become known as the Dogman to me and my crew. We had just finished up our search for the day, and were heading back to camp. I was at the front of the line walking when I saw something out of the corner of my eye on one of those long boulder fields that are scattered all throughout. I immediately stopped and began looking around, trying to see what it was that I had seen, but there was nothing. Just trees and bushes all around. I thought, man, I'm tired, but that looked like a wolf. I might have had some kind of spooked expression because one of my other guys asked me what was wrong. I told him what I saw. He told me he saw it too. I thought you were going to yell at us or something for stopping. We all continued on towards camp when one of the guys who was walking behind me told me to look up ahead of you. I look up and see a very large wolf standing in front of us, roughly 60 yards away. You have to understand, these weren't just wolves. These were extremely oversized, very large, and standing upright. We decided to move out away from view of this thing, and immediately, we noticed we were actually surrounded by several of them, hiding up in the trees all around us, and we never knew it the entire time. Completely panicked by being surrounded by these large unknown wolf creatures, we fled back the way we came, while having our weapons drawn. It was dark, and it did not help that we were running through the thorn bushes and rocks as quickly as we can go. We took cover behind a large rock outcropping, where we waited until our supervisor showed up, along with 2 other fellow rangers. We told them what had happened. We didn't know how to make of it or what to make of it, but I didn't care what they called it, and I still don't, because I know what I saw. That night was just a warm-up for the following night. That's when we really got our first up-close and personal look at these creatures. During the search for a lost hunter, we made a pretty good plan on how to handle the search. I was the point for our team, which consisted of 2 rangers and 3 law enforcement. We were searching a drainage that I knew to be a very dangerous and dark spot because of a lot of loose rocks, steep hillsides, and thick underbrush. This is where the hunter was last spotted. Quick note, he was not hunting at this point in time. He's referred to as a hunter because he is very well known in the area. My ranger partner, who was roughly 30 feet behind me, had stopped and told me to wait up. I proceeded slowly until I was even with him, and he made me stop so he could show me something. He pointed down into the drainage and said, "Do you see that? What is that?" I looked at what he was pointing at, but I couldn't see anything of significance. Instead, my partner insisted there was something there. Looking at it from this angle, I realized there was an unnatural shape to the bush down in the drainage. I had my M16 with me and immediately handed it off to my partner, who stayed back as I slowly made my way down towards whatever was down there. I got within 5 feet of the object, which turned out to be a downed log. I heard the most terrifying growl right behind me. My heart jumped into my throat, and I immediately turned around to face whatever it was that made the sound. Immediately, in front of me, were 2 of these creatures. All I can see in the dark at first was their eyes. They had reflective red eyes, which is what really gave me the impression that they were these wolf things at first. They got up so close to me, I could see their teeth and hear them breathing heavily with the growls coming from their throats. One of them actually stuck their arm out to grab me, but I was able to be pulled up just in time by my fellow ranger who had heard the growling and began coming down to find out what was going on. We decided not to fire at these things. We didn't know exactly what we were dealing with here. I didn't know how much of this I could take. It was now getting really real for me, but I kept my composure enough to tell my partner to call in backup. We were able to get back up onto the high rock bluff, where we were able to get a signal on our radios. We relayed the message to my supervisor. There was something out there, and we needed backup immediately. He ordered us to remain as quiet as possible until they could respond, which I thought would be never at this point. But it wasn't long when we heard them coming in right behind us. The ground shook, and we could smell the wolves in front of us. But they didn't move until a bright spotlight shined on them down in the drainage. The front wolf, or whatever you want to call it, stood still for a moment, as if it was wondering what this light was before getting up and turning back toward us and leaving us in the dark once more. Both of them ran off into the night, which we did not pursue. We knew there was a search team coming up behind us, so we waited for them in hopes that they would be better armed with something more than what we had before going back down into that pit of hell. During this time, I noticed that the wolves were nothing like any dogs or coyotes I have ever seen. They were gigantic, taller than a Great Dane, and much wider. Their legs were straight up, wide apart, allowing them to easily put their front paws on a human's chest, ripping it open if they wanted to. When they ran, they were kind of hunched over, with their back end raised high in the air. I also noticed they did not have any real teeth, except for many sharp tiny teeth and long canine fangs extending past their lips when their mouths were open. After this night, that would be the last we would encounter of these bizarre creatures. I'm not sure what they were or where they came from, but I have no explanation for them. There were over 20 sightings just like this one recorded way back in the 70s, while many of us still work there.
Not me, though, and many more since. At one point, they were referred to as wolves of death because there seemed to be a sort of pattern to how they killed. We would find many large bison and other large game animals killed in disturbing ways. Not killed and eaten like traditional predators do. Torn to ribbons and mutilated. It's like whatever was killing these animals was killing just for the sake of it. Moral of the story is, whatever these creatures were or are, they are extremely dangerous and should not be approached by any means. There's no telling what they would have done to me had I not had my team with me, or had I been caught down there with less equipment than I had. Just know whatever you see out in parks is not natural and should be avoided at all costs. The ranger who was with me that night had a pretty good run as far as rangers do, but from what I've heard, he retired around the same time this thing happened. He just kind of fell off the face of the earth, so to speak, which we all found strange. I'm not sure if there was any follow-up done by our park management after these sightings, but I didn't hear anything about it happening again, at least on paper. Before I begin, let me just state that me and my brother, before this happened, have always been huge Bigfoot enthusiasts. We have dozens of Bigfoot books, from Bigfoots in America to several films like The Boggy Creek. I still don't know all there is to know about Bigfoot, but I do feel for sure that Bigfoot actually does exist, especially now, long after our sighting. It was around 2 a.m. one night, back in the year 1990, on a camping trip to Lake Whatcom in Bellingham, Washington. This is where I had my first Bigfoot sighting. Many people have heard Bigfoot stories, and many more won't believe them at all. But as an avid Bigfoot hunter myself, I can assure you that he is real, and I have an incredible experience to back it up. I was about 14 years old, and my big brother, let's call him Big B, and myself decided that we would go camping on a big island in the middle of Lake Whatcom. While Big B was 18, he wasn't necessarily smart or reliable at times. This time proved to be one of those moments. A Bigfoot sighting is an experience that only happens once in a lifetime, and the encounter I had was simply unforgettable. The Bigfoot sighting took place at around 2 a.m. Big B and myself were sleeping soundly in our camping tent on this big island. In a short while, Big B said he heard something outside. It sounded like a Bigfoot. He was sure it wasn't a bear, but rather some kind of large animal that walked upright on two legs. While Big B and myself were Bigfoot hunters, or so we thought, we had never actually set eyes on one. I told Big B that it was probably just a bear, but my brother insisted that it was not. He then said he saw something very big walking around outside the tent in the dark of the night, just lingering around outside. But Big B refused to get out there, out of the tent, and have a look. When Big B told me Bigfoot was there, I decided that maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea if we both just got out of the tent together and had a look around. But Big B said no, because Bigfoot would see us in the open and run away before we could grab our gear. Big B insisted that we stay in the tent. Then, we heard this screaming noise unlike anything either of us have ever heard before. It chilled us to the bone. We were terrified. I was scared big time, never feeling so scared in my entire life before that encounter. This Bigfoot sighting happened on a relatively calm night, without really any wind whatsoever. This scream was so loud and terrifying sounding. The first time we heard it, I was convinced Bigfoot was actually going to come back and kill the both of us. How do I know it was a Bigfoot you might ask. How could I be so sure? Nothing in the wild screams like this did. Nothing makes that sort of noise. Nothing else could possibly scream so loudly and be so terrifying. We simply waited in our tent the rest of the night, too afraid to go back outside in case that thing was there. When the sun came up the following morning, we packed up and left as quickly as possible. We didn't say anything about what Big B had seen to any other member of our family, but I'm sure they knew something had scared us both very badly. It took a long time for Big B to get over this incident, but he never said anything about what happened. Neither did I. Years later, while we were sitting in a small diner on Vancouver Island having a dinner get-together, my brother brought up the encounter again. He told me he was still having nightmares about Bigfoot from that night. I'm telling you, neither of us have ever forgotten about it. Hi, what lurks beneath? I had what I strongly believe to be a Sasquatch sighting from a few years back now. I am a full-fledged believer after this. Here's my story. My sighting took place during the evening, with me being about 5 miles away from my vehicle location. I was walking my dog along a creek in the woods. Then, off in the distance, I see this strange creature. At first, I thought it was a person, but as we came closer to one another, within 20 feet of each other, I noticed that this was actually a Sasquatch creature and had extremely long brown-looking hair. It also had ape-like features, walking on 2 legs. The creature looked at me for a few seconds. Then, it slowly turned away from me and continued walking towards the direction of where I was originally walking my dog. When I say it came within 20 feet of me, it actually was hiding behind the trees, moving quickly towards me at first, like it didn't see me. This is why I was so weirded out that it had gotten so close to me. As soon as it came out behind a nearby tree and noticed me, it very quickly retracted its steps, stealthily, moving behind many of the trees. My dog was very on edge the entire time. I walked back towards my car afterwards, completely stunned by what I had just witnessed. I am fully convinced that Sasquatch is indeed real. Something that's been on my mind ever since was how close it got to me. That this Sasquatch creature could have very easily hurt me or killed me had it wanted to. But instead, it just walked behind the trees out of the sight into the forest, like it was more interested in just staying hidden. I just can't help but wonder why. One quick note that I wanted to mention about this Bigfoot creature is that it wasn't the massive hulking Bigfoot that everybody thinks about. It was roughly the same height as me, maybe 5'9", and much more slender than displayed. Not at all built like a large ape or a bodybuilder. Its facial features were also very ape-like, as discussed previously. The one thing I noticed most of all were its eyes. They were a dark brown, almost black in color, with almost no discernible white. I am convinced that Sasquatches are very real after this sighting. I would like to stay anonymous because I'm submitting a report of a Bigfoot sighting. I don't want people thinking this is some sort of a joke and not taking me seriously. I've seen it with my own eyes, and now I'm going to share my story so that you can see for yourself what's really out there in the woods. Please, don't use my name attached to this email. I was out deer hunting when I saw it for the first time. It was the morning of November 30th, 2011, right around 9 a.m. I had been sitting in my tree stand in what they call around here Sasquatch country for about 2 hours waiting to see a large buck. The woods are thick so I thought with any luck, I would see one sooner or later. Even in the winter, with everything died down, the woods were still pretty dense. I was busy sipping on a coffee that I had purchased from Dunkin' Donuts, and was already a little jumpy, just from the sheer adrenaline you get with hunting, and all the caffeine pumping through my veins, when I heard something below me. The sound of brush cracking underfoot. Not thinking much of it at first, I quickly finished sipping my coffee. But then, another loud crack caught my attention. Whatever was making the noise had to be coming around my stand on my west side. Slowly, I twisted in my harness and looked down through the brush, and that thing stood about 40 feet from me. Unfortunately, there were still some leaves stuck on the branches, so I couldn't exactly see clearly down to ground level. Then, the thing that I'm talking about comes into full view, and I can only describe what I saw as something that looked like an ape. No other way to really describe it. It was black, but pale white face and chest. I'm estimating this thing to be somewhere between 8 and 10 feet tall, because as soon as I laid eyes on it, my first thought was, holy crap, this thing is huge. It stopped, let out a grunt, and just kept walking. It then turned to look in the direction of my tree stand. Now, I was a little scared at this point, because whatever it was, it had just caught me staring down at it. It stared for what felt like minutes, then slowly sauntered back into the brush. But I didn't leave my stand until about an hour later, after hearing nothing else from it. The next day, I was telling everybody what I had seen. Some people thought it could have been a bear, just because of the color of its fur. But I'm sticking with what I saw. This was not no black bear. I'm planning on going back up there during deer season this year to try and get a better look, if I can. I was driving out in the woods near Prineville, Oregon, with my friends back in October of 2013. This encounter will always stick with me. We were heading towards a local park to hang out and do some things that, young people do when they get bored. Drinking, smoking weed. We ended up getting turned around on the roads in Prineville, and we decided to just head home. We were traveling on a bumpy, dirty road that was winding up a mountainside. As everybody knows, my friends and I enjoy driving fast, and were doing so this particular night. When we rounded a turn in the mountain, I spotted something large stepping out onto the road in front of my car. Immediately, I slammed on the brakes and stopped in time to avoid hitting it. But by the time I slammed on my brakes, this strange, hairy object was already gone. It had disappeared into the brush that lined both sides of the road. I could not see any shape from the headlights, so I got out and went to investigate, worried about my car. As soon as I got out of my car, my friends were yelling at me, "Get back inside the car." They saw something apparently stand up in the brush on the one side. I didn't see it, nor did I see what they were talking about, and I wanted to make sure I was not just seeing things. They were now screaming at me, so I jumped back in. Just as I get in, we all look over and see this large, hairy figure with glowing red eyes chuck rocks at our car. I have never seen anything like this in all my life. My friends and I were terrified, screaming at me to get us out of there. So I attempted to turn the car around and back down the road. But with the road being the condition that it's in, you obviously can't just floor it without heavily destroying your axles. This figure was walking toward us as we began turning and reversing. Whatever this thing was, it was pissed. Massive, bulky, covered in long black hair, and these huge red glowing eyes. It kept chucking rocks at us, One rock smashed into the side of my car, denting it, leaving a few other dings. Then, it threw a larger stone, roughly the size of a football, and it hit at just the right angle and shattered my entire back window, nearly striking one of my friends in the head. We could all smell this horrible musky odor coming from whatever this thing was. The smell had a pungent, rotten stench. It almost made us vomit. It was like really, really bad body odor, mixed with skunk. This figure kept moving towards us, and at one point, grabbed something off the side of the road, which from our angle looked like a large log or stick. Then it chucked it right at our car. This thing knew what it was doing, hurling this heavy object nearly right through our shattered backside window. All of this happening within 10 seconds of turning around and this thing pelting us. As we drove further out, we heard this horrible scream like nobody has ever heard before. It was terrible, like something you would hear in a horror movie. This thing was pissed, and it wanted us to know. The ground was shaking from the footsteps of this massive creature as it began running and chasing after us. I had no idea what it could be, but I'm pretty sure that whatever this thing is, it had not seen humans before, or whatever it was doing in those woods. We got out of there as fast as possible. Thankfully, this thing did not follow us. As soon as we arrived back on the main road, we called 911 to report the incident, but they wouldn't listen. They thought we were pranking them. After that, I will never go back to that mountain again. I will never forget what I saw, and I will always remember the horrors from that night. I have told seldom people this story, but not many others. People don't really believe it. They think we were drinking or high, but they're skeptical about what really happened. Truth is, we had stuff on us, yeah, but all of us were 100% sober at the time. Nobody had found a spot to even party. It is true. Whatever this thing was simply not human. This thing was easily 8 to 10 feet tall, and judging by its mass, wouldn't be surprised if it weighed over 500 pounds, if not more. I cannot over-exaggerate the terror we all felt in this thing's presence. June 5th, 2018. This is the date that I saw a strange creature. I simply can't quite identify what it was. I'd like to start by saying that I'm a very skeptical person, but can also be quite open-minded. So, I would like for this not to be taken as a joke, or something of the sort. To start off, I sent my friend out to his truck for gas and snacks at roughly 11 p.m. on this day. I was extremely tired and wanted to pass out. I figured getting snacks was a good way to do so. Only problem, I cannot fall asleep. Shortly after he left, a loud thumping noise began coming from the outside of my house, which very much so startled me. Since my family lived in the country, we always had critters and other animals outside. I wasn't too sure what it could have been. I jumped up to look outside my window. It was dark, but I could not see much. And then I see this pale figure out in the distance. It was very large in size and looked dark, but pale at the same time. I can only describe it as being very tall, with somewhat of a weird round shape to it. I watched this figure for about 30 seconds, during which time it seemed to be looking around for something before running on 2 legs towards my house. I panicked. This thing was larger than any man I'd ever seen, and did I mention it was large? I quickly ducked down under my window, hoping it had not seen me. I peeked back up a few seconds later and saw that it was on my porch. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but my phone refused to focus on this thing. It was strange looking, tall, and very pale white. It had a very bizarre looking head and kept making these strange noises. This creature, whatever it was, began slowly walking around my house. It had a very strange gait, like it was drunk or something. It walked very close to the house and occasionally would stop to look into the windows. I stayed silent, hoping this thing would not see me. I hid at just the right spot, so it never saw me, but I saw it, and I'll never forget its face. It reminded me of how a goblin would look. After looking around for a few minutes, this being seemed to just disappear. I wasn't sure if it had left, so I stayed quiet and hid even longer. When I finally made myself move, I went to my car and grabbed my gun. I live in New Mexico, so we're allowed to carry guns. After walking outside with the gun in tow, I didn't see anything. I figured it had just left. I mean, I hadn't heard any noises for a while, so I decided to go back inside. After getting up the courage to enter my own house, I went in and took some time to think about what happened. After sitting around for a whole 15 minutes, thinking about what all took place, I just looked outside again to see if whatever that thing was could still be around. I heard a noise coming from outside, but it was actually my friend pulling back up from the store. He comes in and told me about what he had seen. I had seen the same thing. I guess he saw it while coming back, and he didn't think I was completely crazy or just seeing things. I explained to him that this was not a person or any animal I have ever seen. We don't know what it was, but there's no way that it was anything human. Like I said, I'm very skeptical and open-minded, but this was something else entirely. This happened on a very sunny morning, out on the water with the sun's beautiful rays beaming down. I reflected upon how little we know about this world and how much more there is to discover. It makes me wonder if this creature had anything to do with my thoughts that day. As I rode across the lake surrounded by lush trees, I just felt alone in the world. My dog, who was lying down near my feet, began to act strangely and seemed on high alert. Then I saw it. A singular creature ran past me at full speed and was gone before I could even comprehend what had just happened. In that brief moment, I witnessed an upright animal that stood on its hind legs, almost like a human, only with grayish-brown fur all over, except for its face, which seemed to be white or gray in color. Whatever creature this was ran just inside the tree line of the right where I was at, and my dog was now going crazy. Then this thing sticks his head out of the trees and looks directly at me. I could see long pointy ears, glowing red eyes, a snout similar to an elk or moose, and a tan head. It was not like any animal I had ever seen before. However, what startled me the most was that it seemed to have facial features of a human being, like a short, stocky man. It stood about 6 feet tall from what I could make out of its body, while it was crouched down by the tree line with its head sticking out at me. It appeared canine looking, but very human-like as well. I, scared completely out of my wits. This thing lets out this small grin on its face, like it had just found prey that it was going to devour. It's like we had just encountered some sort of freak werewolf creature, or something. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. I turned my boat around and began rowing as fast as I could, with the creature still staring at me from the shoreline. Once I was far enough away from these woods, which seemed to be full of a mysterious presence that day, I noticed how strange it was that this thing did not go out into the water to pursue us, In fact, when I turned around to see it, if it was still there, it was actually gone. As I rode back to the dock, my dog, who was sitting near me when all this occurred, appeared traumatized by what she had seen. She would not even look at the water or even go near it again for several days after that. We have never seen anything like it before or since, and I don't think we ever will. I live in the woods of upstate New York. Used to stay in a small cabin on the bank of a small creek. I heard a strange noise outside and went to investigate. I looked up and saw a very strange creature flying over the creek. Honestly, I thought it was a person with wings at first, but I'm not sure that the height of it was from my perspective. The span of its wings looked to be about the size of a full-grown man. It appeared to have very broad shoulders, long arms, similar like that of an ape, yet it had a very human-like face. It appeared to have fur, or fur-like feathers, covering its body, and was dark brown in color. It flew over the creek and disappeared off into the trees. I have never heard or seen anything like this before, and I thought I should share my story with you. I tried doing some research and looking into what this could have possibly been, but I'm not too sure. It definitely was not a bird, and I don't believe it was like a dinosaur or anything. Either due to the fact that he didn't flap his wings once when flying, it appeared to glide at a constant speed and direction without flapping its wings and was moving fairly quickly. There are stories all over the world of a man-bird and man-bat type creature, but none of them are as well established in local folklore as that of the birdman. There's a county in northern Michigan, Delta County I believe, where for years reports have been made of a creature with a man's body and an eagle's head. This beast has been seen along Lake Superior for generations, along with the infamous canine cryptid known as the Michigan Dogman. Then, there's the possibility it was what's known as a bat squatch, judging by its appearance. As far as I'm aware of, bat squatches are unknown, and there have been few to little reports of them. I'm not sure what it was, but one thing is certain. Whatever it was not some sort of ordinary bird or animal. Even the Chippewa Indians had their own tales of large flying hairy creatures that would swoop down and abduct lone wanderers from the villages. The thunderbird, of course, is a mythical creature with roots in many northern Native American tribes, and has been described as this enormous bird with great wings outstretched. A very large creature that would attack people and take them away, never to be seen again. It can't be a coincidence that this description fits the thunderbird, mothman, or bat squatch. But while there seem to be many flying cryptid descriptions and sightings, none of them 100% quite fit exactly what was seen that day. I was driving through New Mexico later on in the evening. It was around 11 p.m. because the sun had already gone down. I was driving through a remote area on a long straight road that stretched for miles and miles ahead of me. The road's shoulder was narrow, and there weren't any cars on the road, so it was safe to go at normal speeds of 55 to 60 miles an hour. Suddenly, on my left and slightly ahead of me, I saw a coyote standing in the middle of the road. But this wasn't any normal coyote. It was an upright, walking coyote with a strange face that had only one eye. I slowed down to around 40 miles an hour when I saw it, then braked when I got close. As I passed it, however, the coyote quickly shot across the road and stood on the other side. Then, it continued to stare at me as I passed, then turned around and ran off into the desert shrub that grew alongside the road. It left such a strong impression on my mind that even today, I still remember it vividly. I also had my windows rolled down, and a foul odor lingered behind. I can't describe it. It just stunk badly. There were many types of werewolf sightings. Some people report seeing full-fledged werewolves, while others say they saw a strange person that transformed into a wolf. There are even those who claim to have seen half-human creatures called were-hybrids. As for me, I'd like to talk about something different from all the other reports out there. In my opinion, a werewolf is actually a wolf or the spirit of a wolf that possesses the body of a human. The Native American Indians have many legends about these werewolves. Sometimes they are referred to as skinwalkers, a person who could shapeshift into an animal at will and who uses the ability to help mankind, or for evil. According to one legend, the human body is nothing more than a tool that allows man to possess many things, such as looks. It's possible that it is also a tool for possessing animal characteristics in order to be able to fulfill special tasks. These legends and stories about werewolves have been passed down from generation to generation among many Native Americans. But many of these stories are also present in other cultures all around the world and go back centuries. However, while I don't necessarily believe that what I saw was exactly a werewolf by any stretch of the means, I believe it could have been a skinwalker of some kind, based on its appearance and how it seemed to not want to have been seen. I've thought for years about how that coyote creature was a strange thing. Coyotes are mostly active at night, so maybe what I saw was actually just a coyote. But what about it being upright and the strong odor it left behind? I can't quite figure out why, who or what, but something was up. This is not my story, but my father's. It's a story he's told me many times while I was growing up. Here's what happened. It was the early 60s, and my father, an avid fisherman, was on vacation from his stockbroker job in Dallas, Texas. He had decided to spend the rest of the summer fishing in the bayous of West Louisiana. He was out on the bayou in his little flat-bottom boat with his fishing gear and cooler. He had been there for about 2 hours when he noticed a strange object in the water. It resembled a piece of driftwood, but as he got closer, it appeared to be moving a bit. He decided to try for a closer look and threw his anchor out to see if he could snag it. To his utter astonishment, the piece of wood began moving away from him. It had now moved close enough for him to get a good look at it, what he thought actually might just be a sea monster. He soon realized that this creature was actually an eel, or some species of snake-like fish. However, this was not any eel he had ever seen before. This thing sprung out of the water, nearly trying to attack my father. This eel-like fish was also incredibly sized, over 9 feet in length. It was a dark shade of blue, and my father said that when it reared up out of the water to attack him, he said its face was very distorted, like it was mutated, looked nothing like any creature he's ever seen. He never even considered trying to catch this thing. It tried to attack my dad for a brief moment before going back into the deep water. This story gets stranger. That evening, my dad decided to remove the anchor and leave. At only about 75 yards away from shore, he noticed yet another creature swimming toward his boat. This thing looked like the thing he saw earlier, but slightly smaller. He idly remarked that this could have been its child. This thing was more green than the other one, which was blue, and it suddenly leapt out of the water at him. This one didn't come close enough to actually reach him, because he had started up his motor and sped away as fast as he could. This occurrence spooked my dad so much that when he returned home to Dallas, without ever picking up his fishing gear, He said he never told anybody about these creatures at the time, and it was only much later that he even ever brought up the story. I'd like to believe my dad, but there's sometimes it sounds a little unbelievable. There are many skeptics out there who say they have explanations for everything. I'd like to know what you think. On November 25th, 2009, I was part of a crew on the commercial fishing boat, the Bounty, out of San Diego, California. We were fishing tuna about 18 miles off the coast, and had already caught several bluefin. All the crew noticed something very large swimming towards the boat, far bigger than any whale we'd ever seen. We thought it was more bluefin, until we saw it wasn't shaped like tuna. It was like a strange eel with long, slender body, maybe 25 feet long, and 4 times as wide. The head, judging from under the water, was much wider than any whale or dolphin. This thing swam directly under our boat, in a very straight pattern, going down deep towards the bottom, but not actually popping up for air. At that point, everyone on board could hear distinctly 2 very large gaseous bubbles slowly rising to the surface. Then, this thing swam off into the distance. When we saw the bubbles rise to the surface, I'm pretty sure that means it eats by sucking whatever fish or other ocean life there is near down enough into its large mouth, using those 2 air bubbles rising to the surface as a vacuum to suck up anything nearby. We were all blown away by this sighting. What kind of sea monster is that? How did it evolve? Those are questions we've been asking ourselves ever since. We all try to rule out what fish it could have been, but none of us could ever really come to any sort of conclusion. It was totally different than anything we've ever seen before. If anyone has any idea of what this creature could be, please let me know, along with your opinion. Thank you for reading. I grew up in Southern California and spent my whole life at the beach. I'd been surfing since I was a kid, but never expected to see something like this. Something prehistoric. It was spring, on an overcast day with a few days of rain. I went out with some friends of work, and we were looking for some big waves. We got out far from shore, and by that time, it seemed pretty clear, so we began paddling into some surf, when one of my buddies pointed ahead towards what looked like 2 dolphins playing. They were coming straight at us, which he didn't think they did, because of their blunt noses or whatever. Then we realized these were no dolphins, but whatever they were had huge sets of jaws coming straight at us. The whole thing scared the hell out of all 3 of us, and we began paddling back to shore like crazy men. When I looked around after a while, my other 2 buddies, I found that one had disappeared completely, and the other one was lying face down in the water, 20 yards away. I pulled him aboard my surfboard, then paddled as fast as I could towards shore. Luckily, managed to beach it before he drowned. He said he was so frightened by what he saw under the water, he instantly fainted, nearly drowning. We found my other friend about 15 minutes later, up on the beach, so the whole ordeal lasted about half an hour. I described what we saw to a biologist friend. They said it was probably some kind of prehistoric shark or sea serpent that still lives in the deep parts of the ocean. I mean, judging by what it looked like, it very well could have been. It was disturbing, to say the least. My buddy and myself are both still pretty shaken up over the whole ordeal. I guess I'll never look at the ocean in the same way ever again. Eric B., 31 years old, Santa Monica Beach. My grandfather served as a commander aboard a submarine back in World War II, and has always relayed this story. Sadly, he passed away back in 2011. But this story of his, I'll never forget. Basically, for a period of time, this submarine was patrolling an area just outside the UK. I couldn't tell you exactly when during World War II this was, but just sometime during those events. They got a motion of a very large object moving towards them that then very quickly diverted away. The only thing they could come up with was that it was an enemy vessel, except two things. Number one, an enemy vessel could not have been this large, and number two, an enemy vessel could not have gone this close and retreated, not without attacking. There were no other Allied ships or vessels in the area that day, and it really makes me wonder what exactly they encountered out there in the ocean. My grandfather adds that it could have been some sort of large aquatic animal, or maybe a whale. This was a military vessel, so they would certainly have fired upon it if they thought it was an enemy submarine. They stayed in the area for another couple of days, but nothing else occurred, and there were no other sightings until then, at least the end of this tour. Some people may think that my grandfather was just making up stories to make himself seem like he has seen more action than he really did, as indeed many do, but I know him too well to believe that. He was always quite the patriot, and wished he had served longer, but not by any means could he be accused of embellishing on any story. Even he believed that, judging by what was read, that whatever it was much larger than a whale. We're talking huge in size here. I can't tell you what exactly it was, but I'm sure anybody who has served or still does serve in any branch of the armed forces, while many have stories, some may be just as exciting as this one, if not more so. It's not every day you get a sea monster sighting story from a submarine captain, after all. I was once on a 35-foot wooden shrimp boat built in the late 50s with a pair of 350 Chevy engines for power. Our captain that night, Captain Jim, had been working these boats for over 20 years, and most times, when the sea got this calm, he'd always come up to the bridge and tell me how flat it was out there. Not tonight, though. Tonight, he'd stayed down below his bunk, looking ill as could be, and told me not to bother him unless my butt was dragging behind me. It wasn't until later that night we could see this strange creature rise up out of the water, then quickly descend back down again. If Captain Jim wasn't feeling so sickly, he would have been down below standing watch, like always, telling me what fish I could expect to catch, and chances are, I probably wouldn't be writing this now, as they had never seen that thing. I was sitting on top of a tall platform called the Fly Bridge, overlooking the skiff, when I first noticed something moving under the water, about 100 yards away off of our port side. This seemed strange because all night long, everything had been dead, so my attention was turned away from whatever this disturbance might be for a few minutes. I sat there for a few more minutes, then looked down to my right again, but this time it was much closer and appeared much bigger. I'm not the person who gets creeped out by many things, so at first I wasn't really sure what to think of this new development. But just then, something large breached the surface, about 100 yards off of our port side, and began slowly moving towards us, revealing itself in greater detail with each passing second. Our boat was dead silent, besides the sound of water gently sliding up along our hull. So, even while it was a ways off from us, I could clearly hear its blubbery flippers slopping against the surface as it wove from side to side, searching for fish. This was the first time I'd ever seen a creature like this with my very own eyes, and it took me several moments to realize it wasn't a fish at all, but rather some kind of monster that vaguely resembled a whale, but was more clearly something much different altogether. I have no idea how long it was, or how long it swam there, perhaps circling our boat for almost an hour before finally descending back down into the depths below, taking most of the light above. Just then, Captain Jim heard the commotion coming from atop where I was standing, making his way over to the top of the steps leading up to the bridge. "You see that?" I said to him. "I sure as hell did," he replied, with a look of terror on his face. It was pretty big, too. I could tell by the tone of his voice just how much this had shaken him, and when I looked over at his eyes, they were full of fear and bloodshot, almost as though he'd seen something truly terrible that had haunted him deeply. This was only one night in an otherwise long life of seafaring adventures, but it's impossible for anybody else to understand what it feels like to be alone out there, so far from land, and just to know there is something lurking beneath the surface, waiting to strike whenever they decide they're hungry enough to devour a whole boat of live fishermen. I had just thrown another log onto the fire, and my friend had gone quiet. We both noticed we were not alone. A hush fell over us as we looked around, wondering what it could be. We noticed a figure in the dark on our right side, and just then, my friend yelled out. We didn't realize it until later that we had even seen something move from behind us to our left too. But for now, we thought that maybe whatever it was might have been coming closer. The fire in front of us flickered a bright orange and yellow all across the trees, while the night sky above us threw down only stars and darkness. We sat there for what seemed like 3 hours, waiting for something to happen, when suddenly, my friend stood up and pointing into the air, shouting, "What is that?" pointing at a tall black shadow between the trees close by. I stood up slowly and tried to imagine what it could possibly be. What innocent and plausible explanation I could think of. This wasn't as terrifying as it seemed. But as the figure came closer, I knew there was nothing innocent about it. There was no logical and obvious reasons for it being there. Looking back, the best way I can describe it would be that it looked like one of those inflatable balloon people. Those giant, long, thin people that stretched out arms and legs. Only, while those seemed to be fun and inviting, this long, outstretched shadow person, or whatever it was, seemed to literally ooze with evil intent. I crab-walked backwards, desperately wanting to get my feet and run, but my body refusing to do so as I asked. I'm not afraid to say I was completely petrified. My buddy was luckier, and once the thing had started moving, so had he, and I heard the roar of an engine and understood he made it to the truck, knowing that I might end up stranded here with this thing. That alone gave me the boost I needed to get my feet, but for a moment, I was still frozen to the spot, standing but unable to run. And that was when it moved faster than it should have been possible and was right in front of me within seconds. All I could think and feel was that I was going to die. I was so cold, and there was this awful stink. I could hardly breathe, and when I had made myself open my eyes, since I had practically screwed them shut tight with fear, I realized the dark mass was see-through, and I could make out the fire behind and through it. I don't know what would have happened then if my buddy hadn't have blasted the truck horn, but it snapped me out of whatever trance I was in, and I ran faster than I ever had before, going towards the beams from the headlamps of the truck. We got out of there, and didn't even bother to return for our stuff. We had been hiking for days at this point, and after running from that thing, we were exhausted. We came into a small clearing, just sitting there for a while. We could have stared at the tall trees that surrounded us forever if we didn't hear something in the woods growling at us. It was long and low, and animal-like. We were still catching our breath when it started again. Louder and closer this time. Whatever made that sound had been watching us for some time. Who knows how much longer it would stay unseen. I threw on my pack quickly, and my friend already having his on ready to go from taking a quick break. When he turned around to see me struggling with mine, he quickly offered to take most of it off me, which I gladly accepted without hesitation. I grabbed the knife out of my pocket and slowly stood at the ready, in case this thing would come back for us. We weren't amateurs or city boys looking for adventure, ending up well out at our death. We had been hiking, camping, hunting, you name it, for years. We were what you would call experienced. Therefore, we knew this wasn't a bear, or a cougar, or some sort of regular mountain animal. This thing was tracking us, using stealth and smarts like a human, except for the speed and agility that it seemed to be using to follow us and remain so far unseen. And that growl. Up until then, we heard only it moving through the trees and the quick, heavy breathing, or more like panting. Hearing that low, guttural growl now made my blood run cold. It was angry. That was the kind of noise my dog made when it felt threatened. God, I wished right then that we would have brought the dogs with us. Right at that moment, stood back to back, me with a knife, and my friend, a large stick he'd found lying on the ground. We were so completely exhausted, we barely had any energy left to put up a fight. The thing made a noise again. This time, however, rather than the low growl, it was more like a howl, telling us it was ready to make a move. And sure enough, the trees and long grass where it was hiding started shaking, and I made a split-second decision to throw the knife in that direction, like I was some sort of circus performer knife thrower. Whatever gods were on our side right then must have believed in us enough. I hit the mark, and we heard a high-pitched scream of what seemed to be pain. Before I had a chance to recover, we ran. We ran faster than ever before, somehow pushing through the exhaustion. I think pure fear giving us the adrenaline we needed for energy, and we made it back to base camp. One of our friends did not believe us, thought we were being dramatic and making stuff up. So we went back and followed the trail. We refused to join him. When he saw him again a few days later, he changed his mind. He'd found my knife on the ground and a large area of dried blood, and some pure white hair. Not fur, but hair. Safe to say, we haven't been back there since. I swear, I saw some sort of dark apparition in the woods. I'll tell you about it. I was walking home from a night out with some friends. My house is roughly a 25-minute walk through deep woods at the end of my street. I was at a point where I had about 10 minutes left. So I figured I would speed up a little bit and see if I can make it home in 15, since I enjoy going on long walks anyway. It was almost midnight, so there really wasn't anybody else outside but me and the occasional night dog walker. When I got about halfway through the woods, which is where this weird feeling began creeping over me, I ended up running most of the way back to my house. Once I made it to the last street before my own, suddenly everything felt eerie quiet, except for crickets chirping randomly here and there. Something was following me, and it was in the woodline. It was almost pitch black. There was very little light coming from the moon, and almost no street lamps, until you got closer to the houses. My cell was almost dead, and had gone into battery saving mode, so although I had the light app on, it was practically useless. You know that feeling you get sometimes, where you are sure you are being followed, and when you finally get the courage to spin around, there is just another random person heading back from the store or listening to music, completely oblivious to any anxiety they might have caused you. I had that feeling now, but tenfold. I couldn't think of any innocent reason to find someone trailing behind me, minding their own business at midnight in the dark. Every single Hollywood horror movie cliche seemed to apply. It suddenly got super cold. It was almost silent when there should have been all sorts of critters about. And the very second I finally willed myself to turn around, my phone died completely. If this had been Halloween Part 75 or however many there are, I would have been a goner for sure. No, I didn't see Michael Myers when I turned, but there was something there. It was hard to see, of course, since there was almost no light. But yet, I could clearly make out a solid, dark mass. Something far bigger than a person, and also appeared to be floating. I stood there, rooted to this spot, for what seemed like an eternity. But judging by the time on my watch when I finally got home, must have only been a few seconds. I watched in absolute dread as this mass seemed to get bigger. Then something in my brain just yelled, "Run!" And I did. I can't tell you what it was, as I have no idea, but whatever I saw that night, it wasn't right. It should not have been there. It wasn't natural, and it sure as hell wasn't there to make friends with me. I know monsters exist. I saw one myself one day while out helping my father, who was felling a tree. I was watching from a distance, and in one moment of inattention, I saw something appear on the side of a tree opposite of me. It was not a human figure, but its shape suggested it might be humanoid. Anyway, as soon as I noticed this thing, it lunged towards my father. For clarification, this happened around 10 years ago. My dad has always been a big guy, really strong, and I was a skinny kid, around 12 or 13. Although I was used to helping out, my father had told me to take a step back, as he worked on a particular part of the tree. At this point, we were a bit further into the woods than we would usually have been, on account of there having been a storm and a lot of trees that had been damaged. Dad wanted this particular wood to work on, so we'd gone further in to make sure we found just what he was needing. Being in Pennsylvania, there are also a lot of caves and caverns out here in the woods, as well as huge expanses of trees. I know better than to mess around down there. No, that I ever thought of anything weird might happen, but I've also seen what a nasty snake or spider bite can do. I've heard rumors of there being huge drops in the caves, and no way of pulling yourself back out. That was the closest I'd ever been to them for years, and I wonder now, looking back, if the thing I saw maybe lived down there. What made it come out and go after my dad, I have no idea. Maybe that tree meant something. Maybe the sound awoke it. After, when Father was recovered, although we never told no one else, and we never went back down that far, he said he thought maybe the tree was marking a grave or something. This thing was territorial. Anyway, I was just standing there when this thing screeched and appeared to slash at my father, using its arm and what looked like these long claws, so sharp they cut straight through his shirt, tearing his arm open. He was successful in managing to swing back at it with an axe in his other hand, and whatever this thing was, met with axe. It screeched much louder and ran off. Well, I say ran, but it sort of skittered about, like a giant spider that was pale and humanoid, and on two legs. It would be really hard for me to tell you exactly what it looked like. It was tall, but no more taller than my father. Really pale, almost like an albino. Completely hairless, having very long arms and legs. The head was almost featureless. Large black eyes. No nose or really much of a mouth that I could see. Just holes. We ran like hell back to the house, cleaned up my dad's arm. He didn't want to go to the doctor. I mean, what would we tell them happened? It took ages for those gashes to heal, and he had an awful fever for days following. So he just slept for hours. So yeah, I know for sure there are monsters out there. And if something like this exists, just what else is lurking about in the forests? My parents have been staying out of their property, and they've been seeing a strange creature coming up to the house. The creature is about 7 feet to 8 feet tall, with dark brown hair all over its body. This creature has appeared on the back porch of the house, and even tried to break in one night. I have seen this beast myself when I've been visiting my parents out there. It's hard to describe what it looks like, but I will try my best. It has a big head like a gorilla, very large muscular arms and hands, thick neck, surprisingly thin waist for the size of the rest of its body. I remember looking at its face from afar, thinking that it had human-like eyes, slightly slanted downwards towards its nose, which was smaller than expected, compared to its massive head. But as soon as we locked eyes on each other, it turned and ran off. I haven't seen it since. I'm thinking maybe it's a Sasquatch or something, but I don't remember reading anything about them having perky ears and a long snout. What are your thoughts? My wife and I were deer hunting on our property, out here at the end of November 2011. We had been hearing strange noises all night, and early into the morning. So, we decided to get up around 4 a.m. to go have a look around. On our way out, we noticed some strange tracks that had come down out of the woods to investigate the deer feeder we had. They were very human-like in shape, but not quite human. They were around a foot long. From behind my wife, I noticed what appeared to be 2 eyes glowing red from about 150 yards away on the other side of our property. We began walking towards it, looking for a good place to shoot, when this thing took off running full speed towards us on all fours, getting larger as it got closer. Yelling at my wife to get back in the house, it was then I realized this thing was not going anywhere. So I pulled the trigger, hitting it square between its shoulders, sending it flying forward, head over heels. As soon as it hit the ground, this thing jumped up and was gone into the woods. We later found out that this thing had been harassing one of our neighbor's dogs, almost killing it on several occasions, even chasing it up onto a porch. My neighbor ran it off with his four-wheeler, but thought he was just dealing with some crazy redneck who liked to dress up in fursuits. I guess he didn't realize that this was a real animal. It is now January of 2014 at the time of writing this, and we have not seen a trace of this creature since, although I am almost positive that we are still being watched until something else shows up on the property again. And it will. I believe in Bigfoot and cryptids, but this is something else entirely, and most certainly not a Bigfoot. I had a very disturbing experience with a rather strange canine creature just recently. I was driving on a very remote highway at night, well after midnight. I happened to look up into the hills to my right and saw 2 glowing reddish eyes looking back at me. So I slowed down and began honking my horn with headlights on bright high. The creature stepped out from behind a tree and began walking toward me, then took off running across the road in front of my vehicle. It basically looked like an extremely muscular, tall dog, but somehow different. No tail or anything like that. It had long, dark hair all over its body, with straight-up pointed ears, almost witchy looking. Then, it comes running to my truck, almost ready to tear into my tires, tearing them apart. I had to rip out of there very fast in order for this thing not to tear into my vehicle or I. It was blocking my path, so I put the truck in reverse and it ran after me at a fast pace. It was so close to my vehicle that it scraped up against the tailgate as this thing passed. I got out of there very fast, and once I was able to get around this creature, its eyes just glowed like red fire in the headlights. Who knows what would have happened had this thing actually got inside my truck and got to me. Back in 2020, I went camping for a few days up in the mountains when I had an encounter with a creature I can't quite explain. I don't want to say werewolf, but it resembled one. Let me explain. I was camping up in the mountains and had just finished cooking my dinner. It was dark, so I went to light a fire while I prepared my tent. Before putting out food on the fire, I felt something out of place, so I looked around but didn't see anything. After I finally prepared my tent and everything was good, I fell asleep. When I awoke from sleeping, I heard something outside, quickly jumping out of the tent after grabbing my knife. What met me was something I could not quite believe. It looked like a werewolf, maybe 7 feet tall, with these glowing amber eyes. To this day, I have no idea what it was trying to do, but it made me run back to my tent, scared for my life. I heard it making a terrible roaring noise, and it stalked my campsite the remainder of the night. I never actually saw it again. I have 8 years working in law enforcement, and yes, I do believe there is something out there lurking in the night. As far as what I've seen, if you cannot prove it to me, then indeed it's a possibility. But for now, anything is possible. I guess even werewolves, or something that resembles them. I'm not sure if this is really part of the story, but it is an interesting addition. On the way back down the following day, I saw a large doe, dead right near a stream. Its head was torn completely off its body. The carcass appeared to have been freshly killed with zero trace or evidence of it being eaten on. I inspected the area for a good hour and cannot explain what happened to it, so I have no idea what killed this poor deer or how it died like this. I speculate that it was done by whatever creature it was that came at me in my camp. I saw these strange wolf creatures out on the back side of my property one time years ago. I was riding my horse, and there were 2 of them. They looked like dogs, except for the fact they were standing bipedally. I saw them off in the distance, and they turned and disappeared over the rocks into the brush. I have had several other sightings and strange encounters with these things over the years. I believe they are real creatures, and perhaps once wild dogs that went feral from lack of hunting, or something like that. I mean, who knows? I need to do a bit more research. I believe they are wolves that have just managed to evolve into this higher accelerated species of canine. It's just speculation, of course. The other time I saw them was when we were out riding horses again, and I see these things watching us from a distance. Again, they turned and disappeared. I'm not sure where they went off to, but I could just sense they were very close by. There are several other strange sightings and encounters as well, but I need to talk with my father about those. He remembers many more of them than I do. In fact, he will be sending me the information at a later date that I may post. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but these creatures are very similar, and I have experienced them more than enough to believe that a Bigfoot exists. It would be great if you can do a comparison of the two. I need to do more research, but I believe these are a real phenomena of animal life. I just have no idea why or how they ended up here, or what it is they're after exactly. This sighting occurred in the fall of 2018. I was sitting at my deer stand in the dark, and right before I hoped, I saw something moving in the leaves. With adrenaline pumping through my veins, I grabbed my rifle and walked over to take a look. No animals were there, at least none that I could see. But something just didn't feel right though. I could feel the presence of something in the area, like something just wasn't right, although I couldn't place it. I sat up in the stand as I climbed up, and I heard this rumbling growl. I turned down and looked around, still not seeing anything. Frightened, I waited there for safety when I heard something large following me in my direction. As I looked down a second time, I saw it approaching from behind the stand. It had to have been at least 8 feet tall, perky ears, and looked very strange. I could see these red glowing eyes. I jumped off the stand and ran like hell back to my house. Then, once I got to the house, I barred myself inside and was up all night long. I didn't know if it would come back. I heard this thing chasing me the entire way back, but I had refused to stop and look. I ran and ran as fast as I could, eventually making it back. I believe I had walked into this thing's territory somehow, not realizing it. I had no idea that when setting up a stand there, I was going to be greeted by this thing. I don't know if it was a Dogman or a werewolf, but I feel like whatever this thing is, other people out there have encountered the same thing in their own neck of the woods. The next day, when I gathered my wits about me and looked around the area for prints, I found none. If this creature did indeed follow me to the property, I hope its plans were nefarious. Back in the spring of 2018, I was camping with my friends at a lake in the Adirondack Mountains. Me and 2 buddies took sleeping bags out towards the deep woods, looking for a good place to sleep. We wanted to be far enough away from other campers, but not so far that we would have to walk all night long in order to get back before breakfast. It was getting late, and we weren't exactly sure where we were going, so we stopped and decided to pitch our tent by an old tree stump. I thought that I saw a silhouette of something staring at me through the darkness, but when I looked again, it was gone. There are no bears or wolves out here, according to my prior knowledge, so I couldn't think of what else it could have been, staring at us like what I saw. The wind shifted, bringing with it a wave of the most awful stench I've ever tasted. I used to spend a lot of my time helping my uncle on his ranch, where awful smells were a part of his daily routine. So it wasn't like I was really a soft city boy that had never gotten a whiff of any of the foulness that nature can truly serve. And that was just as there was something unnatural about the odor. Not just in its potency, but okay, it smelled evil. I couldn't spell it out for you what evil smells like, but I just knew in that moment. The smell lasted less for than half a breath, and then, like the creature I'd seen, it was gone. I tried to tell my buddies that I thought there was something out there with us. Not only were they not impressed, they were irritated, thinking that I was trying to scare them. I got irritated just the same. We had words and we spent a stretch of time not speaking to each other, just setting up our sleeping gear I got barked at several times for not being much help getting things ready. I kept gazing all around us. I was on high alert, and I didn't know how to turn it off. I couldn't bring my eyes down to my hands to perform menial tasks. My buddies told me to drop the childish game, that I was never going to really scare them. Words, at least convincing words, failed me. We all went to bed mad at each other. The anger distracted me for a short while, just long enough that when I heard sounds outside the tent, I was surprised. I held my breath for so long that it's a wonder I didn't pass out. It was as if I knew, down on a cellular level, that if I allowed one more breath in or out, we were dead. I listened to the footsteps outside. They didn't seem concerned with masking their presence. Twigs snapped, leaves crunched, and most troubling of all, I heard snorts. Have you ever heard a dog snort so hard that it almost sounds like a bark? That's pretty close to what I was hearing, and my friends were either sleeping through it, or they were frozen solid, as I was. Just as I thought the thing out there was going to leave, I'd hear it come back again. It slowly dawned on me that it was circling us, slowly and deliberately. I wondered if it was pacing. Then it hit me. What if the guys were trying to scare me? Desperation drove me to consider how far either of them would go to get somebody to trail us while we were camping, and make an all-night affair of sucking me out. My fear was slowly turning into anger, just enough to allow me to breathe and reach for the zipper of the tent. I was going to find out what was really going on. My heartbeat knocked me back down as the zipper opened, blasted me with the stench of evil from before. It was the briefest perception, but it shook me, made me pause and ask myself if I was really up to finding out what was making the noises and the stink. I pushed my way outside the tent with my ribs rattling from my own heartbeat. There was a full moon with patches of clouds that winked. That awful evil smell came to me in snatches as the breeze stirred, and couldn't exactly make up its mind which direction it was going to blow from. Did I really step outside my tent without my flashlight? I did, and I didn't want to fetch it for fear I'd have knives or claws in my back the instant I turned. I looked in the general direction that I thought I heard the last few footfalls. I saw nothing, but I swear that just as I had smelled evil, I could feel something looking at me. The moon unveiled briefly. It struggled to trace the outline of something standing about 30 paces away from me. The thing was so dark that it was nearly invisible, save for the glint of moonlight finding its edges. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in the devil, demons, angels, or anything else. But the thing that the moon was trying to show me was enough to turn me religious for just a moment. 4 curved horns jutted from this thing's head. The head was goatish, but not without human features. It had 2 long ears and twitching. It was when it bared its teeth that I thought I saw one of its earlobes had something hanging. It could have just been a bit of matted fur, but it got to me for the moment. There I was, facing something that was not only anything unlike I'd ever seen, but there were those little details that it could have been intelligent. My brain transformed the bared teeth into a smile. It was indeed taunting me. I couldn't handle it any longer. I yelled. I wanted to yell words, but amorphous howls were all I could manage. The raw evil radiating from the thing reduced me to basic instincts. It ran away on 2 legs, a strong bounce in its gait, but the backbone of the thing moved its torso with serpentine reptilian movement. My friends found me screaming. They also found that I had messed myself. They wanted to laugh, but the implications held them back. They knew that I wouldn't have gone that far just to prop up a prank. Our relationship shortly thinned after that. The creature may have not done us any bodily harm, but something about it lingered that tainted our friendship. Our unbreakable bond became cracked and was never the same again after we encountered what I believe was the Goat Man. Me and my two best friends were out for a camping trip, out in the deep woods. We've been going to the same place now since we were very young, and it's not exactly new ground. So me, age 26, Ben, 27, and Chris, 29, all of us are close to 30 now, decided to make this our one last trip before we all let our childhood innocence go. You know, I kind of regret that decision, but I guess none of us thought we'd ever have a good memory to replace it with after this happened. Keep in mind, here these guys are my best friends, and brothers in all but blood, but if something happened to them, I'd protect them with everything I am. I guess you could say that I found out everything I'm not. Much of our camping was a little ritual of remarking at how small everything had gotten since we were kids. The towering cliff was just now a large rock. That dramatic waterfall was now just a sharp slope where the creek ran down. All of these were things we remarked at every single time we camped there. It was like a museum of relics from a time gone by, and we cherished each one. There was only one thing that we weren't so fond of. There was a hole in the hillside that was big enough to be a rabbit's warren when we were kids. It was the one thing that seemed to have gotten bigger as we got bigger. Wow, that's still there, is the most any of us would ever say about it. And most of the time, we pretended it wasn't there. Chris was the one that questioned our apprehension out loud. He asked us why we never really would look at it, or what was down in the old hole. Only after ever hearing him raise the matter did it seem so childish and ridiculous, being so intimidated by a simple hole in the earth. Each of us tried to articulate what it was that had kept us spellbound with fear over it. None of us could manage my explanation that made sense. I said that it just didn't feel right to look at it too long. I couldn't explain why I felt that way. Chris proposed that we camp within an eye shot of the hole, just so we could say that we overcame our fear. Looking back, I think I could tell that he really didn't like the sound of his own idea, as if there was something about that hole that bothered him so much, that he wasn't going to be at peace until he found a way to lay it to rest, and he was dressing that childhood fear up as some personal hurdle we could conquer together. None of us liked the idea, but we did it anyway, so we could be rid of the phantom fear. Night came, and there was a halo of silence and stillness that surrounded the hole and the area around it. Maybe I would have felt better if I had heard something moving around in there. But that absolute emptiness, stillness, that unknown that escaped us from childhood, was somehow more frightening than anything else. When there finally was a sound in the quiet, it wasn't coming from the hole. It was coming from Ben. I thought he was trying to creep me out. He stood outside the tent and started whistling some creepy little tune. It didn't help that we couldn't whistle very well. Then he was chuckling. I wanted to tell him that he was planning on doing something, that he was already giving himself away. But his footsteps and his whistling and chuckling faded. I can't even tell you why I bolted out of the tent in that moment, but I did. Somehow, I just knew. In the LED of my phone, I saw his scrambling into the hole as the best he could fit. I grabbed him one ankle and pulled him out. The look on his face is something I will see for the rest of my days. He didn't look horrified like he had seen a ghost or anything like that. He was smiling so hard that I thought his head would split in half. His eyes were wide open, like his eyelids had been cut off. He couldn't live on his own anymore after that. He was placed in a mental health facility, where he would spend most of his time sitting down with that strained grin on his face. He wouldn't blink. Nurses even had to artificially moisten his eyes. And out of nowhere, he would have terrible fits. Nurses would be forced to restrain him. Of course, there was a rational explanation for all of it. He was that 1 in a million cases of young dementia. They were baffled as to how it became so pronounced without any warning signs. They certainly weren't going to buy into our story. Well, we didn't really have a story. We camped out near a hole we were all afraid of as we grew up. What did it do? Suck his soul out or something? I don't know. We never really sat down and analyzed it. But me and Chris knew that our campsite had more to do with Ben's condition than the doctor's test would ever reveal. We never went near that place ever again, and I have no idea what the hell is in that hole.
Call me crazy, but I never imagined I would have seen an animal like this in my life. I was hiking out in the backwoods of Ohio. I will not disclose further information about location for obvious reasons. This is when I noticed a rustling in the bush. When I looked closer, I saw it move. In my shock, I dropped my phone and nearly jumped over a tree to make myself appear as big as possible. It was a bipedal wolf. This thing was absolutely colossal sized. As soon as it noticed me, it bared its teeth and growled something terrible, like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It's hard to describe how frightening this experience was, really. The animal definitely had evil intentions, or so it appeared. Only after all these years could I even come close to describing what this beast looked like. Even though the creature was covered from head to toe in a dark, mangy kind of fur, with patches of disgusting skin, it had a lot of features that seemed pointed and sharp. Its nose, for example, was sharp and angular, ears that were swept back and looked more like horns than anything else. The fur on its cheeks were swept back as well, giving it the appearance of spikes. Claws so long that it's honestly a wonder they didn't break off during everyday use. They were probably as dense and hard as a knife. The monster that they were attached to didn't look like it had any real use for finesse. It had all the earth tone colorings you would expect from any wildlife dog, but some of the darker aspects of the fur kind of created lines around the eyes and cheeks, like you would see in some species of cats, or so it reminded me. It was both wild and sophisticated, mundane and occult. The eyes had a withering effect on me when I caught sight of them. The only real way I can describe the faint lighting coming from them is the way the light behaves when you place a candle instead of a jack-o'-lantern. The way it pulses and flickers. I saw more than just one light when I looked into these things' eyes. I saw something even worse. Intelligence. And then, in that moment, when I was trying to make myself look like I could hold on my own, I saw amusement. It tilted its head, the way a confused dog might, but there's no confusion anywhere in its eyes. My bladder ultimately releasing, and somehow I knew that it understood that I was completely terrified out of my wits. Like a baboon singled out by a lion, my brain commanded me to do one thing, and one thing only: run. I only looked back once. The monster was still just standing there, and it was either surprised that I even saw a point of running, or it was letting me get a head start. I was running so fast and so hard that when I tripped over a fallen log, I went sailing through the air, face planting so hard that I saw stars. But the adrenaline caught me from feeling my injuries, and I continued running at a respectable speed with a limp. After a while, my brain started telling me that I was running on a ruined ankle. The fact that it was penetrating my survival mechanisms told me that it would truly not last much longer. I I looked behind me for only a second time in the pursuit, and my heart sank when I saw that this thing had no trouble keeping up with me. It was barely even straining. I could hear its footsteps slapping the forest floor. It's like it was moving in for the kill. What followed probably lasted less than 3 seconds, but I felt the whole thing happen in slow motion. My arms pulled up the side of the trunk. A great chunk of it came off in my hands, worn away over the years of presence of termites and other things. My body swung, anchored only by the other arm. In my new position, I could appreciate the fact that the walking wolf creature had sprung for the kill, its mouth wide open like a fiery crocodile, coming straight for my face. If I'd only been a half-second slower, this large, jagged chunk of wood in my other hand would not have found its way down the creature's throat. The monster still slammed into me, knocked me down from the tree, but its tension had been completely stolen by the wood, which was now lodged in the space where my flesh had meant to be. It appeared to roll over in a kneeling position, coughing and hacking. The impracticality of its long claws became apparent, as its long nails have no use to getting the wood to ease out of its throat, and it couldn't do much of anything without injuring itself. It finally shook its head, but the force wasn't enough to free the wood. And the pain, the blinding terror, and the exhaustion, it still entered my mind to help this thing, but only for a split second. The pain in my ankle was like being electrocuted. I got up and fled, as fast as I could. I don't know what I did to sour my luck so bad that day. The only reason I was able to get medical attention was because I had blindly hobbled out onto the road when a patrolling park ranger hit me with his jeep. That's what got me a bad shoulder and a broken collarbone. Hope you enjoyed this story. I'm still living with the residuals. Driving back in the evening, my girlfriend, who was sitting in the passenger seat next to me, pointed out that she could see this large upright dog in the distance. I laughed at her, saying dogs don't walk on their hind legs, but as she pointed and got me to look, I saw what she was talking about. I pulled over, stopped the car to take a photograph, but before I managed to get it out of my pocket, the dog was already sprinting up towards us. The fear on my girlfriend's face as she turned around in her seat, looking at the beast, was something I will never forget. The speed at which the monster had closed the distance between us was almost supernatural. The closer it got, the more I could appreciate just how much I underestimated its size. I'm far away, and I thought I could have easily been a man in a Halloween costume. But this thing was so much taller. I was convinced I was looking at the real deal, and no man in a costume would have thrown itself against the passenger side window with such force that cracks wept through the glass. My girlfriend's screaming filled the cab. I was trying to get the car started as much as possible to get away from this thing. All too slowly, the car started and lost forward as I hammered the accelerator. I did this just in time to clip the sides of 2 more of these creatures that had been coming towards us head on. They were just a little too slow, jumping out of the way, and either side of the front of the car likely gave 2 of these monsters an old man hip. I fishtailed for a few seconds, but straightened out the car. We were now cruising at a steady speed, apparently fast enough to leave these things behind. I question this, because when the first one had made contact with the vehicle, it was like a bolt of lightning, ninja fast. My girlfriend was in hysterics. I unfortunately was unable to calm her down. I regret to say that I let the moment get to me, and I kind of barked at her a bit. That didn't help anything. I almost considered taking her to the hospital to make sure she wasn't going to have a heart attack. She told me that she didn't want to go anywhere except home with me. She didn't want to go to her place. She did not want to go to her parents' place. She did not want to go to the hospital. She just wanted to be near me. Her safety. I don't think she thought that statement through. I live out in the sticks. Coyotes, bears, and very likely wolf monsters are probably going to be my next door neighbors. Her home was very much in the city, but she didn't live with any roommates or anything. So, naturally it would make sense that she didn't want to be alone. So, I didn't argue. As soon as I could see and think straight, I headed home. I had to close the gate behind myself. I was very self-conscious when I got out of the car and opened the gate for us. I killed the motor and listened for a long time with the windows cracked. I didn't dare move my girlfriend's window. It was so badly damaged. I was afraid it would fall to pieces. Neither of one of us wanted to be the first one to get out of the car. I thought of my dad's rifle that I had in pieces. I promised that I would keep it disassembled unless I absolutely needed it. He wanted to pass it on to me, but he also wanted to make sure that no kids or company of mine would accidentally shoot themselves. At length, we both get out of the car, and I swear that as soon as I shut my door, I heard the strangest, most blood-chilling howl I have ever heard roll to me from somewhere in the distance. It was like faraway thunder, made by something big. You could hear it miles away. My girlfriend began whimpering. I urged her not to scream, for fear we would be heard. Deep down, I knew it was these monsters, probably having razor-sharp instincts. We got inside, and I made her comfortable on the couch, or as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. I hit up Google and started looking at images of werewolves and lycans and other things. The problem was that these things defy the stereotypical picture of a werewolf. If the Egyptian god of death, Anubis, had been stripped of his official clothing, then that is exactly what we would have saw. No wild fur. They were sleek and shiny, tall and short, smooth, like black onyx stone. I got busy putting together my father's rifle. I didn't think I'd actually ever have to put it together, so I experienced much frustration as I struggled to remember exactly what went where. In an instant, my blood ran cold when I heard that same howling from before. I had turned on the TV for my girlfriend, which meant that the howling was louder than the TV itself. That meant that this thing had gotten closer. Something told me that I had a very long night ahead of me. I told my girlfriend that she could have my bed, and that I wasn't going to be falling asleep anytime soon. The thing is, she wasn't going to be sleeping either. She was so shaken up and her eyes were wide open constantly, as if in perpetual shock. Her exhaustion eventually caught up with her, dozing off in front of the television. I was surprised she didn't wake up when, in the middle of the night, I heard the sound of shattering glass. My instincts screamed that these monsters had found the house that they were breaking through. I found, however, that the monsters were actually attacking the car instead of the house. Whatever scent they had locked onto, it led them to our vehicle. They finished shattering my girlfriend's passenger side window, followed by the windshield. 3 towering, sleek bodies poking their faces all throughout the interior. I could still see their eyes glowing. I didn't find whatever they were looking for, so they began tearing it up. Had we really looked out that much? Or did they really lock onto the scent of the car and not us? I don't know. They saw us, but it's not us that they smelt in this first encounter. Thankfully, they never came back, but my girlfriend and I are still very much traumatized from the whole incident.
Only being a rookie on the search and rescue, I was deeply disturbed by my findings. I was assigned to the crime scene, where I had found a dismembered body, abandoned by the side of the road. Nevertheless, I was grateful for any experiences that would help me grow as a wildlife officer, and I knew that this experience would provide excellent training opportunities. The victim's head and limbs were all scattered across several yards from each other. Due to this fact, we were able to determine the animal responsible very easily. Our clues came in our general surroundings. Pieces of clothing or belongings are usually left behind after an attack due to fear of being identified, as in cases with humans as well. The one huge drawback to this was the further we investigated, it didn't match any known killing of any local wildlife we knew. Usually, we were able to identify teeth and bite marks, scratches and claw marks. There might be fur of an actual animal here that we tested, but not making any sense. Nothing came up as a match in our vast systems. No one could identify the clump of orange-looking matted fur that was left by the victim's head. Worst of the matter, it almost looked as if the head and limbs had been ripped from the body. Not mauled or torn with teeth or claws. Ripped, using brute strength. Now you tell me, what the hell kind of animal would be able to do that? Once the police and medical examiner came, removing the body and any evidence, we were able to further explore the area. Since I was only a rookie, I had to tag along with one of the older guys, and to be honest, I was okay with that. I wasn't sure I was going to get the sight of that body out of my mind for a long time. The boss told him we had to check the area. Until that point, I didn't even know we split the area by letters, and before I could even glean any more information, we were off. I noticed my buddy had made sure the rifle was loaded and ready before we ever headed off. We drove around for a bit, taking the truck through the woods and hiking trail until we got to a far denser part of the parkland that I had never been to before. The ranger just sat there with the engine idling for a bit, looking into the trees in front of us, which were way too close together to drive through. It was weird, but I would have sworn there was something like fear in his eyes. "This is as far as I go," he told me. "Not only because the truck can't get through, but we don't belong out there." Of course, I had to ask what he meant by that. So I asked him, "What do you mean don't belong? Rangers can't go. Is it private land?" He looked at me and replied real seriously that people can't go in there, and it wasn't just exclusive to rangers. I wanted to ask more, but his silence seemed to imply that that was the end of the conversation, at least for now. And although it seemed to be a real odd thing to say, I didn't think too much of it. Not right then, anyway. We drove back to the ranger station, having scouted the area and not seen anything else suspicious, or indeed anything else at all. There didn't seem to be a deer, rabbit, or even a bird in sight. There was a strange atmosphere back at the station too. Even though I was still quite new, they'd always treated me as a part of the team, keen and eager to take me under their wing, to help me learn the ropes. I'd been told many stories, and most of them had humorous anecdotes about various findings and when they'd done something silly, which they could laugh about after. But this was different. They didn't seem to want to include me. There were lots of looks passed between them, as if there was something they all knew except me, and I couldn't work out what was going on. In the end, still feeling jittery from the gory discovery, and the fact that no one seemed to know what the hell kind of creature had caused such devastation, I yelled out, "So, what's with all this secret-looking stuff not going into the woods? I mean, what do you think is out here? A Bigfoot? A Wendigo? Don't tell me. There's a UFO hotspot, right?" The room had gone silent, with the boss beckoning over me to his desk. I wasn't sure if I was going to get reprimanded, but he unlocked his drawer and pulled out a map and some various case files. Over the next hour or so, he and the others told me about different incidents they'd attended to over the years. Discoveries that they'd made that either hadn't ended up on the official system, or had been closed with a fake clarification, the category they were really filed under.
was unexplained. Looking in the files into the photos, a lot of the bodies were in a similar state to the victim I had found. Head and limbs torn from the torso, but despite numerous bite marks on the body, fur and feces found nearby, they could not match the animal with anything they'd come across before. Of course, even though I'd grown up reading Goosebumps and watching Supernatural, I didn't actually believe in anything unexplained. That notion was ridiculous. Must be some sort of hybrid predator, like a wolf and a cougar had somehow produced offspring. No, the boss had told me. The DNA blood tested at the scene had no similarities with any other animal, except one, he had told me. He pulled out a sheet of paper from the file, and the printout from the blood found today. It was a match, so the same creature had attacked the latest victim and the person in this older file. Maybe all the files. Then I noticed the anomaly. The one creature it had something in common with. Human. So I asked if a person did this. But it couldn't be. If they really thought it was a person, a human being responsible, why were they looking into it and not the police? I mean, why not the FBI, if there were this many blatant cases? But he told me it wasn't a person, and the DNA says it was definitely not a human, but maybe at some point it was. I can't even really explain how that made me feel, or what I was thinking. It did go through my mind that maybe this was some sort of elaborate prank or initiation, that someone would shout, "Gotcha!" But it never came. Needless to say, the case was closed very fast. I'm guessing the file ended up locked in a drawer, along with the others. For the next few weeks, we all had to double up when we went out, especially if it was dark or we were headed off the paths. Kept the camp and trails shut to the public too. And I still haven't seen a deer or even a rabbit, although the birds seem to be back. There's something out there for sure, but for now, it remains unexplained. My search and rescue experience is not specific to a park, rangers, or even one emergency service. I have been fortunate enough to be exposed to many different situations all throughout my short career. The following are quick stories about some of those incidents. I've only been a ranger now for 2 years, and before that, I spent another 5 years in the military as an infantryman. All that I know is combat, but working with civilians has taught me valuable lessons on how to take charge. Like how I now wish we had increased the search area on this case a lot sooner, and before the weather had changed. It's the weirdest and most frightening experience I've ever had, despite seeing action in the army, because there's never been a rational explanation for what happened to those women. The 3 ladies in question were hiking along a well-traveled trail up to Mount Rainier when they went missing. On the 5th day, it started snowing very hard, and there was no sign of them anywhere. One of their boyfriends had called in, claiming the women were all young, fit and healthy, most importantly. Experienced hikers, even if the weather had taken a most unexpected turn. There was no GPS or cell phone activity from any of them, and hadn't been since the 2nd day. If it had been snowing the entire time, I would have to be more inclined to expect to find 3 frozen bodies, but the snow had only just begun. Albeit that now the snow had added to the problem. It should not have been the cause. I headed up to the last place one of them had used to call, and we located the GPS signal, then followed the trail myself until I reached their intended finish and rendezvous. There was indeed no sign or anything, the snow now covering any tracks I might have been able to spot. I spent that entire day exploring the area as much as the weather would allow me to, checking above me the whole time. You'd be surprised how many clues there are in the trees that regular people might miss. But no, I couldn't find a thing.
It was like those three women just found a hole in the ground and were sucked in. Snow had continued to fall for the next 4 days solid, and we gave up much hope ever finding them alive. Even if they had managed to crawl into some space that I didn't know existed, they'd have likely have frozen to death by now anyway. On the 4th day, so now 9 days since they were supposed to have finished the trail, the weather now grew warmer, and snow began to melt some. So I headed back out, taking one of the dogs with me this time that I had borrowed for the job. See, Old Shep was a cadaver dog, trained to sniff out corpses. As I said, I wasn't expecting to find any of those ladies alive. I'm sure you already figured out this story won't have a happy ending. First off, Old Shep did find something like what I'd been expecting. A leg. One cleanly amputated left leg. No boot or clothing. Just the leg. A leg that, aside from no longer being clothed or attached to its owner, was perfectly fine. Not bruised, not gashed, no bite marks. Then, we found one of the women, just walking on the trail. I immediately called for an airlift, covering her in warm blankets, giving her fluids. She was still fully dressed in her hiking clothes. No visible cuts, bruises, although you could tell from looking at her, she was in shock, suffering from hypothermia, and appeared to be starving. Her pack and cell were missing, despite me trying to find out if she knew where the others were. She was unable or unwilling to talk. Once at the hospital, they checked over her but couldn't find any physical or long-term injuries or issues. No frostbite, no flesh wounds, nothing. As soon as she was warm and had eaten, she was asked a ton of questions, but nothing. She spent months in the hospital, just recovering. Having been moved onto the psych ward pretty early to my knowledge, was barely able to communicate at all, let alone give an explanation. We never found any more of the second woman, other than that leg, and nothing at all of the third woman, nor their packs or cells or any belongings. It just disappeared. But the scariest part, the part that makes no sense, even less sense than 3 fit and healthy women going out onto a well-used trail and only one coming back, is that this is not the first occurrence of a group of people just disappearing, and only one returning without a scratch or mark on them. But no one has any reasonable explanation as to what could be the cause. I would prefer if you left my identity anonymous. I'm not looking for any notoriety, clout, or fame for me submitting the story to you. I would really prefer to stay that way. Alright, so here's what happened. I was riding along with my horses last week, at about 8 p.m. I noticed a bright flickering light that was unusual in the distance. Our horses kept getting spooked, so we walked closer to the area where we saw it. I realized it looked like a man carrying a lantern, walking slowly across the field towards some trees at an angle across from me, slightly in front of me. This being looked very strange. I didn't quite understand what I was seeing. Then, out of the forest, where this ghastly figure disappeared, was this strange canine-looking animal. It was very tall and appeared to have red, amberish glowing eyes, pointed ears, long hair down to its back midway, along its tail, with what appeared to be a large mane, just staring off in our direction. I was in such shock, I tried to get my horses to go forward. They would not. They were rearing up on its hind legs, acting very afraid. I got off my horse and approached this creature with my weapon, about to be drawn, but it quickly retracted itself back into the trees, as if it was waiting for me. I ran into the woods after it. I could hear it running through the brush and climbing trees to get away from me. I followed it in further for about 15 minutes, until I came upon a large open area with many trees. I knew this thing was hiding up in there, just waiting to pounce. This thing was toying with me, and I knew it. I turned around and left the area the same way I came in. I could feel this thing following me, like it wasn't done with me. It wanted to do things on its own terms. Even though I could feel its heavy presence lingering in the area, I left. I was afraid it was going to hurt my horses, whatever this thing was. I was in the woods for a couple of days afterwards, tracking this thing. I figured out that it kills its prey, dragging them back into its den or burrow. There have been many dead game animals, and possibly some missing persons. I'm sure of it. This has not been the first time this has happened either. One of the days while I was tracking this very strange animal, I found a large dugout in the earth that I believe was the den of this thing. It stunk like wet dog and rotting meat and urine, very badly. I nearly vomited. At the edge, there was a strange-looking severed hand and feet lying in a pile. I couldn't tell if it was human or not. It was pretty badly decayed. I know for sure that this thing is killing people around here. Who knows if they're hunting or hiking? It's bold enough to kill right out in the open, apparently. Among the pile of carcasses were also bones littered about, and that god-awful stench. I have no way to prove this was actually the den of this animal, but I can only speculate. On the way back, I would hear strange noises like growling and rustling in the woods all around. The woods would get real quiet, and I'd get this strange sensation that was crawling up my spine, like something was about to happen. I knew I was being watched the entire time. I'd be out walking around, just walking back to my house. Then last night, I was out there tracking this creature again, and I heard something scream off in the distance, yelling several times. It seemed to be coming from the direction of my house, but it wasn't quite clear. I looked around, but didn't see anything in the dark. No campfires or flashlights that could have possibly indicated somebody being out here. I mentioned this to some friends and family that live nearby. They've heard similar things happening at night while being out here, whether they're hiking or walking their dogs. A lot more than once or twice over the years. There's something going on here that people are just not aware of. I almost wonder if this thing has been stalking the woods here for who knows how long. I could be talking about a legend, but I'm pretty sure this creature is true and has been around here for a very long time. Look, there's a lot more to this encounter than what I've told here. I would like to research this thing and maybe find out what it really is, if possible. My gut tells me there aren't mountain lions or coyotes that size roaming around. Maybe not even wolves either. Something isn't right with this story and this creature. My speculation is this, that this creature, whatever it is something that is not from around here, period. I'm not exactly sure where it could have been. I just have a feeling that whatever this is, it is incredibly dangerous and should be avoided at all costs. My sighting happened back in the summertime of 2013. My uncle and I were up fishing on a river near Mount Apica. We parked our truck at the end of a road, went down into the woods, and hiked upstream for about 1 mile or so. It was around 1 p.m. in the afternoon. We had just caught some walleye, so we stopped to have lunch under a big willow that hung out over the river. It was very relaxing, and we were enjoying the warmth of the sun. The willow tree provided a nice little bit of shade, so we set up our chairs under it and ate our sandwiches, filthy and dirty, from fishing. I had just taken a bite when I looked up and saw this thing standing on two legs, roughly 40 feet away from me. It was moving in a really weird way, which I can only describe as being like a bear does when walking upright, but not quite as jerky. It wasn't looking at me or anything, but it seemed to be focused behind me, like whatever it was after was running off in the direction we were in while we were eating lunch, and now had disappeared in the woods. It seemed to be on a mission. At least that's how I understood it. After eating, I walked upstream to wash my mud-covered hands off in the river after it had disappeared, when I heard something large charging through the woods, coming towards me very fast from downstream. The first thing that ran through my mind was it's either a large buck or bear, so I stood frozen, thinking, crap, this is going to be a big bear. It was a little bigger than that, fortunately. It just came right past me and my uncle, who had also come down to wash his hands, and then would later on go to our truck. This huge wolf biped came rushing at us, and then past us. It was full on chasing this huge game that was going by, a large elk. Actually, there were two, one large bull and a smaller cow. The wolf gave pursuit to the larger one. My uncle stood there, stiff as a board, and you could hear him breathing behind. He was completely terrified. The elk, both of them, ran into the trees right by where we had parked and eaten. Then this wolf went past us through that same spot too in a rush after them. It disappeared into the woods about 100 or so feet, but it didn't stop. You could still hear it running on all fours, giving chase, while also snorting loudly as it continued off in the woods. I don't think it saw us crouched down beneath the willow tree eating originally, but then everything got silent again. That's right when we knew we weren't alone. There was another one of these things, watching us, a much bigger one, the alpha male. I could hear it breathing heavily. There was a large cluster of fallen trees right beside us, so I crouched down between some dead wood, and I could see where it was. It was staring at us, with its head slightly cocked to one side. It stayed perfectly still, and unlike the other one, that was more shaggy and wolf-like, this one was completely black and much more built. It made this very odd sound that reminded me of a cattle, but on a much deeper scale. My uncle saw it next, and he screamed out to me, "We have to go now." It caught my attention because my uncle is very calm, and he's never been so stern and freakish in his life. So we just throw our stuff in and jump into his truck, pretty much leaving behind our fishing gear. I knew what this thing was, but I just couldn't figure out why it would be in this place. There were 3 more of them already emerging from the trees, back from where they ran after the 2 elk. What else was here? We got in the truck and drove off back down the road until we came to the paved state road, which would lead us back to town. The city is about 60 miles east from where we went fishing, and straight south of it. When we both returned home, I had explained to my mother what had happened, as well as some family friends who were interested in hearing. They had also apparently heard rumors of a bizarre bipedal wolf living up around that mountain. To this day, I don't exactly have a clue to what on earth we encountered, even though I had a faint idea, or at least I thought I did. But whatever these animals are, they did not like that we invaded their hunting territory. I heard some strange howls, which I believed to belong to a Dogman creature, back in the winter of 2019. I was driving home from work through a wooded area with trees on both sides of the road. It sounded like someone or something was howling at me from the woods, or i.e., my direction, as if it were trying to communicate, although I couldn't understand anything that was being said, nor where it was coming from. I stopped where I heard the noises and got out of my car. After a few seconds, the howls had ceased, and so I got out of my car, just to see, but then got back in my car to leave. But as soon as I began driving again, they all started up all over, and this time they seemed even closer than before, more menacing, surrounding my entire vehicle. It felt like it was trying to keep me from going anywhere, and many times I stopped my vehicle, but never fully parked. I wanted to get out there more than anything. Whatever was communicating with me, if that's what you would call it, felt dark and evil in nature. It was telling me something using those howls, but I could not make sense of them, as if they were a language or a person talking with an accent, and just garbled, angry gibberish. My grandmother had spoken to me all about demons, the devil, ever since I was a child, and even now at the age of 27, this still affects me greatly. So, when hearing these demonic noises coming from the woods around my car, I knew none of this probably makes sense, but the only real way to describe it is like being in this trance and being controlled to get out of my car. After driving a distance away from the area, I went home, but this encounter still haunts me, and I can't seem to shake it off. It's been a few months now since, but I'm still just trying to get my mind back on something else, or better yet, forget about it altogether. This was most certainly not a bear, coyote, wolf, nor a dog. So, don't even bother asking, because that is what it did sound like, but with an angry demonic voice to them. Thank you for reading my report.
To start off with, this was back in 2006, late spring. At the time, I had never heard of a Dogman, even though I lived and grew up all around the state of Michigan, since my parents moved around the state a lot. Anyway, enough background info on me. Here's the story. My parents and I lived in a house at one point, on the outskirts of a relatively smallish town, Lake City. We moved there from another small town called Reed City. Now, this area is very woodsy, so Dogmen were certainly not out of place for me, even before my first Dogman experience. Seeing strange creatures lumbering around near my home was really common to me at the time. We had coyotes that would often visit our yard. We lived right next to a forest. So this night, it was around 10:30 p.m. when my dad pulls back up into the driveway after being out with some friends, maybe drinking or something like that. I can't remember. As soon as we got inside, he mentioned there was some weird dog thing outside approaching the house, but blew it off because he couldn't see that well due to the poor lighting of night. I remember my mom was cursing, as my little brother had been running a high-grade fever, and she'd only just gotten him off to sleep. She was more concerned about potential barking and yapping waking him than anything else. I mean, as far as we know, we had no reason to be scared, right? And I agreed. Sort of. I mean, as I said, I had seen plenty of dogs since we moved here. None had seemed threatening or rabid, or like they wanted to attack. Certainly none had been in the past, at least the boundaries of the property before. Not even the coyotes. Probably since we didn't have nothing they wanted. But Dad was adamant that night that this particular dog-like thing he'd seen was different. For starters, he said it was huge, far bigger than any dog he'd ever seen, even bigger than a wolf. Of course, Mom didn't believe him. She thought that he had just had too much to drink and was simply imagining stuff. She went off to check on my brother in a huff, while my dad, usually a pretty laid-back guy, even after he'd had a few beers, paced back and forth in front of the window in the den, which looked directly out onto the porch into the woods. The yard light was on, casting a very eerie shadow. He cried out. All of a sudden, as I joined him by the window with him pointing, I too could see something I'll never forget. A shadow, a silhouette, something way bigger than just a dog. Two bright yellow piercing eyes staring right in at us. It had come way past the boundary, and now appeared to be actually in our yard. Not quite close enough to be fully illuminated by the outdoor lighting, but enough so we can definitely make out its presence. My dad shouted at me to grab the gun, so I ran to the locker, quickly pulling a shotgun and any spare shells. As he was loading it, Mom called down the stairs to ask what was going on. What's all the commotion about? He told her to stay in Randy's room and lock the door. Sensing urgency in the tone of his voice, my mother disappeared. I knew there was a handgun in my dad's bedside drawer, but I had never been that happy or confident with a firearm. So, besides the very basics, making sure the safety was on, I was as certain I would shoot off my own foot. So I grabbed my baseball hat instead, and I'd play all through high school and had a decent swing. I hoped that would be enough to stop whatever the heck this thing is that was actually outside. I heard a door slam upstairs. Dad slowly opened the back screen door, told me to stay where I was for now, even though he was far more efficient with the shotgun. He did not want to risk there being a scuffle and me potentially getting hurt. He wanted to try and scare this thing off, first and foremost. Surely, he would do anything to protect his family and property. But we weren't violent people, as I was to come out to the yard as a last resort if he needed me, and otherwise was to stand guard at the door. Extra security for Mom and my brother. Watching Dad edge out onto the yard, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was this guttural growl, deeper than anything I'd ever heard, like any animal before. It sounded threatening, territorial, and most of all, pissed and ready for a fight. Dad took a shot towards it. Not on target, but so it knew he meant business, which should have been enough to send it running with its tail between its legs. But this wasn't no ordinary animal. Upon hearing the shot, it pounced at my father, picked him up and threw him like he was no more than a rag doll. He was thrown at the door and landed in a lump on my feet. As I bent down to make sure Dad was okay and breathing, I got a good look at what the heck was out there. It was huge, around 7 feet tall, standing upright on its hind legs, and very, very solid. Like, even though it was covered in hair, you could literally see the muscles rippling underneath, which explained why it had been able to pick up my dad so easily. Its head and facial features were kind of like that of a Doberman pinscher, and it looked mad. Ears pinned back, teeth bared, snarling. Dad seemed to be breathing, but unconscious. I could see his head was bleeding, but he's a big guy, and I was skinny, built for baseball, not wrestling or football. I tried to drag him to the screen door when the thing suddenly held like a wolf, rushing at the house. I'm ashamed to say that fear and panic took over. I slammed the inner door, running upstairs, locking myself in my parents' room, where I knew the other gun was. I threw myself into the corner of the room and crouched down low on the floor, making sure the safety on the gun was off and fully loaded. I hoped to hell I wouldn't have to use it. I could hear all sorts of banging coming from downstairs. I didn't know what that thing was doing. It sounded like it was throwing furniture around, having a tantrum. I don't know. Was it looking for something? Then, I heard a truly awful sound. A sound I had heard hundreds of times before, but now was completely terrifying. Something large coming up the stairs. It felt like the longest few moments of my life as I crouched there, gun pointed at the door. No clue as to whether I'd even be able to pull the trigger, let alone hit this thing when it inevitably came bursting through the door. I was kind of expecting a "here's Johnny" moment as it started to break the wood. I guess it almost made me laugh, and I know sometimes people do laugh when they're terrified. But I clamped my hand over my mouth. I don't want to give away where I was. I could hear doorknobs being violently rattled, then wood being ripped apart from the landing outside this door. 3 times. That would have been the bathroom, my room, Randy's. Why didn't I hear him or my mother make a noise? Then came the sound I had been dreading. The knob on the door to my parents' room began to shake, quickly followed by angry growls as it began to punch through the wood. I could see its furry arms pushing through, sharp claws tearing away at the wood like it was nothing. Then I heard another noise that made my stomach drop. A whimper. I'd recognize it anywhere. Randy and it was coming from the half bath adjoining the bedroom just a few feet away. As this thing burst through the door, I heard my mother scream from behind the door and knew that she and my brother were in the bathroom. The thing seemed to know, too, as it ran straight over to the door, ignoring me on the other side of the bed, which gave me enough time to stand up and shoot. I must have let off 4 to 5 rounds. I didn't know what hit and what missed, but all of a sudden, there was a nasty smell of burnt hair, gunpowder, smoke, and crap. That thing screamed. It sounded like a human, but much lower in pitch. More like a human than a dog, like Hal. And I could see it had definitely been hit, at least once. And there was a huge hole in its left shoulder, blood pouring all the way down behind it, dripping. It must have been hurt pretty bad for my guess, as it began fleeing, blood all over. I guess adrenaline took over as I followed this thing, but it was super fast and disappeared quickly. I couldn't see it any further, but it seemed like it had run back from where it came. This is when Dad had managed to awaken and managed to drag himself fully into the kitchen. He had quite a nasty bump on his head, but was very lucky there were no other injuries. Go to the doctor's office. Dad made up some half excuse for the bump on his head. They were both fine, although the doctor said Mom's hormones were real high and she needed rest. We don't know if it was just a major coincidence, but not only have we never seen one of those creatures up close before, and certainly none have ever tried to attack. Could it have somehow sensed Mom? And if so, what did it want to do? Dad made sure the house was reinforced after, and I don't think nothing could ever get in there now. Not even a gorilla. He still sleeps with the fully loaded shotgun at the end of the bed though, just in case. And my brother slept in my room for years with Dad's handgun under my pillow. We never saw another one of these things, since we knew they were out there. We could hear the howls and growling at night, see shadows moving through the tree lines. Thankfully, our little sister was born not long after. We moved again, and the new house they still live in. It's also nowhere near any woods. I don't think I'll ever be able to have a dog as a pet. Not even something to protect me, like a German Shepherd or a Doberman Pinscher. Just like my parents, I will never live close to the woods. Oh, and one last thing. After the night in question, my parents agreed to not call the police. Had we told them some large upright dog had attacked and broke in, maybe something else would have been marked down. So they didn't bother, in case you're wondering.